long before any of the men who would later be called prophets ever opened their mouths, before the first scroll was unrolled or the first warning shouted in the streets of a city that did not want to listen, the words were already moving. They were moving in the silence between centuries, drifting through the dust of empires that had not yet been built, settling into the bones of a future that no living person could see. This is the strange and terrible quality of prophecy, that it arrives long before its season, that it is given to one generation and meant for another, that the man who speaks it often does not live to see the day his own words come true. He carries it the way a courier carries a sealed letter through a hostile country, knowing only that the message must be delivered, never knowing what is written inside. The world into which prophecy entered was not a quiet world, and it was certainly not a pious one. It was a world of mud brick walls and oil lamps, of barley harvests and goat herds, of kings who measured their worth by the number of cities they had burned. It was a world where a man could be sold for the price of a sandal, where children worked the threshing floors before they were old enough to read, and where the average lifespan rarely climbed past 40 years. Into this world came men who claimed they had heard a voice, not the voice of a counselor, not the voice of a teacher, but the voice of the living God. They claimed it without flinching. They claimed it knowing that the punishment for false prophecy was death by stoning, that the price of speaking what the king did not wish to hear was the dungeon or the sword, and that the people who needed the message most were almost always the people most determined to silence the man who brought it. The Hebrew word for prophet is navi, and it does not mean fortune teller. It does not mean dreamer or visionary or seer of crystal. It means, in its oldest and truest sense, one who is called, one who has been seized and turned and set apart for a purpose he did not choose for himself. The prophet did not stumble into his calling by ambition or accident. He was conscripted, he was drafted. He was, in nearly every case, a reluctant man who would rather have stayed in his fields, his sheepfold, his fishing boat, his counting house. Moses tried to refuse the call by claiming a stutter. Jeremiah tried to refuse by claiming his youth. Jonah tried to refuse by buying a ticket on a ship sailing in the opposite direction. None of their excuses worked. The voice that called them was not asking. It was telling. And once a man had heard it, he could no more unhear it than he could unsee the sunrise. These were not gentlemen. They could not afford to be. The work that was given to them was the work of saying out loud what nearly everyone else preferred to whisper or deny. They stood in the courts of kings and called those kings murderers to their faces. They stood in the temple courts and accused the priests of corruption. They stood in the marketplace and named the rich men who had ground the faces of the poor. They wept openly. They tore their clothes. They ate strange food and slept in strange places and married strange women and named their children strange names, all because the word that was given to them required it. Isaiah walked the streets of Jerusalem barefoot and stripped for 3 years as a living warning to the city. Ezekiel lay on his side for 390 days, cooking his meals over a fire fed with dung, because the message demanded the demonstration. Hosea was commanded to marry a prostitute, to love her, to lose her, to buy her back from her own degradation, all so that the people who watched might glimpse, in the wreckage of his marriage, the shape of God's grief over his unfaithful nation. The prophets did not invent the messages they carried. They insisted on this point with a clarity that bordered on stubbornness. The phrase that opens nearly every oracle in the Hebrew Bible is some variant of "Thus saith the Lord," and the prophet went out of his way to make it plain that the words coming out of his own mouth were not his own. He was the conduit, not the source. He was the trumpet, not the breath. This is why so many prophecies open with the prophet's own confusion, his own resistance, his own bewilderment at what he is being asked to say. Jeremiah complained bitterly that the word of God was a fire shut up in his bones, that he tried to hold it in and could not, that the carrying of it left him exhausted and despised. Amos protested that he was not a prophet at all, nor the son of a prophet, but a herdsman and a gatherer of sycamore figs, whom the Lord had simply taken from following the flock. None of these men set out to become voices of God. They were grabbed by the throat, turned around, and pointed at a future they could barely understand. The arc of biblical prophecy runs longer than any human life can stretch to follow. It begins in the opening pages of Genesis, in the cool of an evening, in a garden where the man and the woman have just discovered the cost of disobedience. And it ends on a rocky island in the Aegean Sea, where an old man, exiled and forgotten, sees a city descending out of heaven. Between those two moments lies a span of roughly 4,000 years, and across those 4,000 years, the prophets carried their messages forward like runners in a relay race, each one handing off to the next, each one adding detail to a portrait that no single one of them could see in full. One spoke of a virgin who would conceive. Another spoke of the place where she would give birth. A third spoke of the price for which her son would be betrayed. A fourth spoke of the manner of his death, down to the piercing of his hands and the casting of lots for his clothes. A fifth, writing 6 centuries before the event, gave the very year in which he would appear and the very year in which he would be cut off. None of them coordinated, none of them collaborated. Many of them were separated by centuries and by continents. And yet their words, when laid side by side and read in sequence, form a single continuous portrait so detailed that it can be answered only one way. This is what makes biblical prophecy different from the divinations of the surrounding nations, and the difference is not a small one. The Babylonians read the livers of slaughtered animals. The Greeks consulted the oracle at Delphi, which spoke in riddles so vague that any outcome could be claimed as a fulfilment. The Egyptians watched the stars and the flooding of the Nile. The Romans, in their later centuries, hired professional augurs who watched the flight of birds and pronounced upon what they saw. All of these systems shared one common feature. They trafficked in ambiguity. They gave answers that could be bent in any direction after the fact. They told the questioner what he wanted to hear, or what he could be made to fear, and they kept their hold on him by being just specific enough to seem credible and just vague enough to never be falsified. The Hebrew prophets did the opposite. They named names. They named cities. They named kings. They named years. They specified in advance, sometimes by hundreds of years, the rise and fall of empires that did not yet exist. Daniel, sitting in a Babylonian palace in the 6th century before Christ, described in detail the succession of 4 world powers that would follow Babylon, and he described the third of them, the Greek Empire of Alexander the Great, in such precise terms, including the swift conquest, the sudden death of the conqueror, and the 4-way division of his empire among his generals, that critics have spent 2,000 years trying to argue the book must have been written after the events. The reason they have to argue this is that the alternative is unbearable. The alternative is that a man living more than 2 centuries before Alexander was born wrote down, in the language of vision, exactly what would happen. There are, by the most generous count, more than 2,000 prophecies scattered across the pages of the Bible. Some are specific to a single city, like the oracle against Tyre, where Ezekiel declared that the proud island fortress would be scraped bare, like the top of a rock, and that its stones and timbers would be cast into the sea. That oracle was given in the 6th century before Christ. 2.5 centuries later, Alexander the Great, frustrated that he could not breach the offshore fortress with conventional siege, ordered his men to dismantle the ruins of the old mainland city and use the rubble to build a causeway through the water. They threw the stones, the timbers, and the dust of Tyre into the sea, exactly as Ezekiel had said, and they walked on that causeway to the gates of the new city and broke it open. The fishermen of that coast still spread their nets on those rocks, just as the oracle said they would. Some prophecies concern individual men, like the one given to King Josiah's great-grandfather more than 300 years before Josiah was born. naming Josiah by name and describing what he would do to the altar at Bethel when he came to the throne. Some concern entire nations: the rise and fall of Babylon, the dispersion of the Jews, the desolation of the land of Israel for centuries, followed by its impossible restoration. Some concern the Messiah, the Anointed One, the Christ, who would come not as the warrior king the people expected, but as a suffering servant, born in obscurity, raised in a town so small it was the subject of jokes, and crowned at last with thorns. And some concern the end of all things, the final consummation, the day on which the long account of human history would be closed and a new account opened. Out of all these thousands of oracles, 5 rise above the rest, not because the others are unimportant. Every word that came from a true prophet was important to the man it was sent to and to the city it was sent for. But 5 of them stand at the load-bearing corners of the entire biblical structure, and if you removed any one of them, the whole would collapse. The first is the long messianic line, the 4,000-year promise that began as a whisper in a ruined garden and ripened across the centuries until a young woman in Nazareth said yes to an angel. The second is the prophecy of the suffering servant, the staggering vision given to Isaiah in the 8th century before Christ, in which the coming Messiah is described not as a conqueror, but as a man crushed for the iniquities of his people, despised, rejected, pierced, and buried in a rich man's grave. The third is the prophecy of Daniel's 70 weeks, given to a Hebrew exile in the court of a foreign king, a prophecy so mathematically precise that it specifies the very year the Messiah would present himself to Jerusalem and the very year he would be cut off. The fourth is the prophecy that Jesus himself spoke, sitting on the slope of the Mount of Olives and looking across the valley at the temple when he told his disciples that not one stone of that magnificent building would be left upon another, a prophecy fulfilled in fire and blood within the lifetime of the men who heard it. And the fifth is the great prophecy of the dry bones and the regathering, the vision Ezekiel saw in a valley of skeletons, in which the scattered house of Israel was promised a return after centuries of exile, a return that lay dormant for nearly 2,000 years, and then, in the middle of the 20th century after Christ, woke up. These 5 are not chosen because they are the easiest to defend or the simplest to explain. They are chosen because they cover the entire span. They begin in the garden, and they end in our own newspapers. They are anchored in geography. You can still walk, and in events that happened on dates that can still be looked up. They were spoken by men who lived and died centuries apart, in different languages, under different empires, with different vocations and different temperaments, and yet they speak with a single voice. Together they form a kind of skeleton key. To understand them is to understand why the people who first heard the message of the early church found it impossible to escape the conclusion that something the prophets had been straining toward for thousands of years had finally, terribly and gloriously, arrived. The men who carried these particular 5 oracles were not interchangeable. Each had a temperament, a circumstance, a wound. Moses, who set down the first messianic shadow in Genesis, was a man who had killed an Egyptian in a fit of rage, fled into the desert, married a foreign woman, and spent 40 years tending sheep before the bush burst into flame and the voice spoke his name. He wrote the opening chapters of the Bible from the far side of his own failure. Isaiah, the courtier prophet, walked the marble corridors of the Jerusalem palace, the friend of kings and the cousin of nobility, and he saw, in a vision in the year King Uzziah died, the Lord seated on a throne high and lifted up, with the train of his robe filling the temple. He never recovered from that vision. Everything he wrote afterward had the sear of it. Daniel was a teenage exile, dragged from Jerusalem to Babylon as a hostage of the conquering king Nebuchadnezzar, given a Babylonian name and a Babylonian education, and yet he kept the dietary laws of his fathers and prayed 3 times a day, with his window open toward the city he would never see again. He rose to the highest councils of 2 empires, served 4 kings, survived a den of lions, and died in his 90s, still in exile, still longing for home. Jesus, who spoke the prophecy of the temple's fall, was a working man in his early 30s who had grown up in a town with no significance, learned a trade from a stepfather, and walked into Jerusalem, knowing exactly what was waiting for him. Ezekiel, who saw the dry bones, was a priest who had been deported to Babylon at the age of 25, and who was sitting by a canal in a foreign country when the heavens opened above him and the visions began. These were specific people in specific moments. They were not abstractions. Moses had a temper. Isaiah had a sharp tongue. Daniel had insomnia, the kind that comes from carrying secrets too heavy for one mind. Jesus wept at the tomb of his friend and sweated drops of blood in a garden. Ezekiel, when his wife died, was forbidden by the Lord to mourn her publicly, because his very grief was to become a sign to a hardened people. Each of them paid for what they carried. Most of them paid with their lives. Tradition says Isaiah was sawn in 2 inside a hollow log on the orders of the wicked king Manasseh. Tradition says Jeremiah was stoned to death by his own countrymen in Egypt. The author of the letter to the Hebrews summarized the cost in a single sweeping sentence, saying that they were stoned, sawn asunder, tempted, slain with a sword, that they wandered about in sheepskins and goatskins, destitute, afflicted, tormented, of whom the world was not worthy. They wandered in deserts and in mountains and in dens and caves of the earth. That is the price of carrying the word. The men who paid it did not always know what their own oracles meant. Daniel, after he had received the vision of the 70 weeks, wrote down that he had heard but he did not understand, and he asked the angel for clarification. And the angel told him to seal up the words until the time of the end, because the meaning was not for his generation. Isaiah, after he had described the suffering servant in such piercing detail, did not see the man whose face he was painting. He died 700 years before that man was born. Ezekiel, walking among the dry bones in his vision, could not have imagined the year 1948 after Christ, could not have imagined a flag raised in a place called Tel Aviv, could not have imagined the ships from Europe carrying the survivors of the Holocaust to the coast of an ancient land that had been emptied of their people for nearly 2,000 years. They wrote what they were given. They handed it forward, and they trusted that whoever read it later would see what they could not. This is what makes prophecy, properly understood, different from prediction. A prediction is a guess about the future based on the present. A prophecy is a declaration about the future based on the eternal. The prophets never claimed to be reading patterns in current events. They claimed to be receiving direct communication from a God who stands outside of time, who sees the end from the beginning, and for whom the year 1948 after Christ and the year 590 before Christ are equally present. This is a staggering claim, and the prophets knew it was staggering. They did not soften it. They did not qualify it. They staked their lives on it, and most of them lost those lives because of it. The standard the law of Moses set for a prophet was brutally simple. If what he says comes to pass, hear him. If it does not, he is a false prophet, and he is to be put to death. There was no middle category. There was no allowance for partial credit, for poetic license, for the spiritual significance of an unfulfilled word. The test was binary. The penalty was capital. Under that pressure, the men who kept speaking, who kept writing, who kept handing the message forward, did so because they were absolutely certain of what they had heard. And the message they handed forward was not a private comfort. It was not a self-help manual. It was a warning and a promise braided together, addressed to nations and to centuries, addressed to readers who would not be born for hundreds of years, addressed in some passages to the very last generation that would walk the earth before the curtain came down. Some of what they wrote was for the people sitting in front of them. Some of it was for their grandchildren's grandchildren. Some of it was for an audience so far in the future that the prophets themselves stared into the distance and wondered who the message was for. Peter, writing in the 1st century after Christ, said that the prophets searched diligently in their own writings, trying to understand what manner of time the Spirit within them was pointing to, and that it was revealed to them that they were not ministering to themselves, but to those who would come after. That is the nature of the work that produced these 5 great prophecies. They were spoken by reluctant men, paid for in blood, handed across millennia, and pointed at a horizon that those men could not see. They concern the deepest questions a human being can ask. Where did we come from? Why is the world broken? Is there a way out? Will the suffering one day stop? Will the dead one day live? Will the long, weary, bleeding history of the human race ever come to a meaningful end, or is it all just noise and dust? The 5 great prophecies answer those questions one by one. They are answers that took 4,000 years to deliver in full. And the first of them, the oldest, the longest, the one that began before any human being had ever heard the word prophet, started in a garden where 2 people had just learned what it costs to disobey. The fruit was already eaten. That detail matters, because everything that comes after it is shaped by what cannot be undone. The man and the woman were standing among the trees they had once walked beneath without fear, and now those same trees were a place to hide. The breeze that had moved through the garden in the cool of the day, the breeze that had once been the gentlest thing in their lives, now sounded like footsteps. They knew, the way only freshly guilty people know, that they had ruined something. They covered themselves with leaves stitched together by trembling fingers, and even the leaves felt like an accusation. The serpent, whose tongue had done its work and was now flicking quietly in the grass, watched the unraveling of everything with what we must imagine was a kind of satisfaction. He had won, or he thought he had. Into that ruined silence came the voice, not the soft, companionable voice of the previous evenings, but a voice now carrying the weight of judgment. The Lord God called out, "Where art thou?" Not because he did not know, but because he wanted the man to hear himself answer. And the man answered, and his answer was the answer of every guilty person since. He heard the voice, he was afraid, he was naked, he hid. The woman was questioned next, and she did what any of us would do. She pointed at the serpent. The serpent was given no chance to speak, because the serpent was no longer a creature in this scene. The serpent was a defendant, and the sentence had already been written. It is in the curse pronounced upon the serpent that the first prophecy of Scripture is buried, and it is buried so deep that whole generations of readers have walked over the spot without realizing what was beneath their feet. The Lord God turned to the serpent and said, "I will put enmity between thee and the woman, and between thy seed and her seed. It shall bruise thy head, and thou shalt bruise his heel." That was it. That was the first messianic promise. It was not addressed to Adam, who stood there listening with his leaves still pressed against him. It was not addressed to Eve, who had not yet been given any name beyond the name of woman. It was addressed to the snake, and it was a sentence pronounced over the snake's future. But hidden inside the sentence, hidden inside that one short verse, was the architecture of every prophecy that would follow for the next 4,000 years. Listen to it again, and listen carefully. The seed of the woman, that phrase alone should stop the reader cold. In the ancient world, lineage was always reckoned through the man. A child belonged to his father's line. The seed, in the language of the time, was the man's contribution. To speak of the seed of the woman was, biologically and culturally, an oddity that nobody in that early epoch would have known how to interpret. It would not have made sense to the people sitting around campfires for the next several thousand years repeating the story. They would have raised the question and shrugged and moved on. But the phrase was there. It was waiting. And one day In a small town in Galilee, a young woman who had never been with a man would conceive a child, and the strange phrase would suddenly fit like a key turning in a lock that had been waiting since the garden. That is the way prophecy works, and the way it worked from the very first oracle. It is given in a form that is not yet legible. It is given in a form that does not need to be legible. The prophecy did not need to make sense to Adam, and it did not need to make sense to anyone reading it for the next 40 centuries. It only needed to be there, deposited in the text, waiting for the moment its meaning would finally rise to the surface. The promise embedded in that single sentence had two halves, and they were strung together like the verses of a song. The first half was the seed. From the woman, somehow, against all biological expectation, would come a particular descendant. Not a generality, not a category, but a specific one, referred to in the singular. He shall bruise thy head. The seed of the woman would, in some unspecified way, deal a head wound to the serpent, and a head wound is a death wound. It is the kind of blow you do not stand back up from. The second half was the cost. Thou shalt bruise his heel. The serpent would not lose without striking back. The seed of the woman would be wounded too, but in the heel, not in the head. A heel wound is painful, sometimes terrible, but it is not the end. It is something you can walk away from, eventually, if you are strong enough. So in this earliest of prophecies, in the very first chapters of the very first book, the entire shape of the messianic story is sketched in 17 words. There will be a deliverer. He will come from the line of the woman. He will crush the head of the enemy, and in doing so, he will himself be wounded. The picture is so compressed that it can be missed. But once you have seen it, you cannot unsee it. Every later prophecy adds detail, fills in color, sharpens edges. None of them contradict the original sketch. They only develop it. Adam, for his part, did something extraordinary in the next breath. After hearing the curse, after hearing the words about the seed, he turned to his wife and gave her a name. Until that moment, she had been called the woman, and that was all. Now Adam looked at her and called her Eve, which means life-giver, mother of all living. Think about the strangeness of that. They had just been told they were going to die. They had just been told the ground would resist their efforts and the woman would labor in pain to bring forth her children. They had just been expelled from paradise and told they would return to the dust they came from. And in that moment, the man named his wife Life. He had heard the promise about the seed. He had understood, even in his ruined and trembling state, that something good had been embedded inside the curse, that from this woman somehow life would still come. When their first son was born outside the garden, in the world of thorns and sweat and labor, Eve cried out the strangest sentence, I have gotten a man from the Lord. The Hebrew is even more telling than the translation. She seemed to think in her hopeful new motherhood that the promise had already been kept, that the seed had already arrived, that this child Cain was the one who would crush the serpent's head. She was wrong, and the wrongness of her hope is one of the saddest moments in the whole story, because Cain would grow up to murder his own brother, and the curse of the serpent would prove deeper than any one woman's joy could undo. But notice what her hope tells us. The first generation outside the garden was already watching for the seed, already counting their children and wondering, already living in expectation of someone who had not yet come. That expectation passed down. It passed through Seth, the son who replaced Abel after the killing. It passed through Noah, the man who built the ark and rode out the flood that wiped the earth clean. It passed through Shem, one of Noah's 3 sons, and the line narrowed. It would have been easier, perhaps, if the promise had been kept simple, if the seed of the woman had simply been a category. But the promise kept getting more specific. With each generation, with each named patriarch, the funnel narrowed. Centuries after the garden, in a place called Ur of the Chaldees, a man named Abram heard the voice of God for the first time. He was 75 years old. He had no children. His wife Sarai, had been barren for the entirety of their long marriage. The voice told him to leave the country he had always known and to go to a land it would show him, and the voice attached to the command a promise so large that the old man could not have understood half of it. In thee shall all families of the earth be blessed. All families, not Abram's family, not the families of Mesopotamia, not the families of the future tribe that would carry his name. All families of the earth. Whatever was coming through Abram's line somehow would matter to people he would never meet, in countries he had never heard of, in centuries he could not imagine. Abram believed the promise. He left. He wandered through deserts in his old age, pitching tents wherever the voice led him, and waited for the son who had been promised. The son did not come for 25 more years. By then Abram was 100, and Sarai was 90. Between the promise and its fulfillment lay a quarter-century of doubt, of compromise, of a disastrous attempt to manufacture the promised heir through a slave woman named Hagar. When Isaac was finally born, when the laughter of impossible joy filled Sarai's tent, the seed had not yet arrived. Only the next link in the chain had been forged. Isaac would father Jacob. Jacob would father 12 sons. From one of those sons, the tribe of Judah, the line would continue to narrow. The seed of the woman had become the seed of Abraham, and now the seed of Abraham had become the seed of Judah. On his deathbed, the old patriarch Jacob gathered his 12 sons around him and pronounced over each of them a final word. When he came to Judah, the 4th son, he said something strange. The scepter shall not depart from Judah, nor a lawgiver from between his feet, until Shiloh come, and unto him shall the gathering of the people be. The word Shiloh in that passage has been argued over for thousands of years. The simplest reading is that it means the one to whom it belongs, the rightful heir, the eventual king. Jacob was telling his 4th son that royalty would stay in his line, that out of Judah would come kings, and that those kings would hold the scepter until the true king came, the one to whom all peoples would be drawn. The seed had narrowed again. The promised one would not come from any of the 12 tribes at random. He would come from Judah. The narrowing continued. Out of the tribe of Judah, the line eventually came down to a shepherd boy named David, the youngest son of a man named Jesse, in a village called Bethlehem. David was anointed king of Israel by the prophet Samuel when he was still a teenager, and the kingdom he founded would be the high watermark of Israel's national life. But David did not stay in his palace forever, and one evening, as he was thinking about building a permanent house for the Lord, the prophet Nathan brought him a word. Thine house and thy kingdom shall be established forever before thee. Thy throne shall be established forever. David's son Solomon would build a temple. Solomon's sons would inherit the throne. But the word forever was bigger than Solomon, bigger than any of David's grandsons, bigger than the entire line of Judean kings that would eventually be carried away into Babylonian captivity. Somewhere in that line, a king would arise whose throne would not pass away. The seed of the woman had become the seed of Abraham, then the seed of Judah, then the seed of David. The funnel kept narrowing. The picture kept sharpening. For about 300 years after David, the kings of Judah came and went, some good, most bad, and the prophets who served them kept handing the messianic promise forward. Then, in the 8th century before Christ, in the reign of a faltering king named Ahaz, a prophet named Isaiah walked into the king's presence with a word that would split the entire arc of prophecy in two. The historical situation matters, because Isaiah did not deliver his most famous oracle in a vacuum. King Ahaz was in trouble. 2 foreign kings, Pekah of Israel to the north and Rezin of Syria, had formed an alliance and were preparing to invade Judah, depose Ahaz, and install a puppet king of their own choosing. Ahaz was paralyzed with fear. He was already considering buying the protection of Assyria, the rising superpower of the day, by sending tribute and effectively making Judah a vassal state. Isaiah came to him with a message from the Lord. Fear not. The 2 kings would not succeed. Their plan would fail. As proof, Ahaz was invited to ask for a sign, any sign, as deep as the grave or as high as the heavens. Ahaz refused. He gave a pious-sounding answer, "I will not ask, neither will I tempt the Lord," but the refusal was a dodge. He had already made up his mind to trust Assyria instead of God. He did not want a sign, because a sign would obligate him. Isaiah lost his temper, which is the kind of detail that tells you the man writing this account knew the man he was writing about. Isaiah turned not just on the king, but on the entire royal house, and through gritted teeth he said, "Hear ye now, O house of David. Is it a small thing for you to weary men, but will ye weary my God also? Therefore the Lord himself shall give you a sign. Behold, a virgin shall conceive, and bear a son, and shall call his name Emmanuel." That is the sentence. That is the 8-word center of one of the most extraordinary prophecies ever spoken. A virgin shall conceive. The Hebrew word Isaiah used was Alma, and the argument over that word has filled libraries. Some have insisted it means simply young woman without specifying virginity. But the word as it appears in Scripture is never used of a woman who is not a virgin, and when the Hebrew text was translated into Greek by Jewish scholars 2 centuries before Christ, in the great translation called the Septuagint, those translators used the Greek word parthenos, which means specifically and unambiguously virgin. They were Jews, translating the Hebrew Bible for Jews. They had no theological agenda about a Christian Messiah, because no Christian Messiah had yet appeared. They simply read what Isaiah had written and translated it into the cleanest equivalent they could find. They chose virgin because they understood Isaiah to mean virgin. There is more. "And shall call his name Emmanuel." The name itself is a sentence. Im means with. Anu means us. El means God. God with us. The seed of the woman, the seed of Abraham, the seed of Judah, the seed of David, was now revealed to be something more than another in a long line of human kings. He would be God with us. The promise had taken a vertical leap. It was no longer just about lineage. It was about the very nature of the one who was coming. Isaiah went on, in the next chapter, to speak again of this child. "Unto us a child is born, unto us a son is given, and the government shall be upon his shoulder, and his name shall be called Wonderful, Counselor, the Mighty God, the Everlasting Father, the Prince of Peace." Notice the names. Notice especially the Mighty God and the Everlasting Father. A Hebrew prophet in a fiercely monotheistic culture was applying divine titles to a coming child. He was either insane or he had heard something that nobody had quite heard before in such direct terms. He kept going. "Of the increase of his government and peace there shall be no end upon the throne of David and upon his kingdom." The child of the Virgin, who would be called God with us, would also sit upon the throne of David. The 2 threads, the divine identity and the royal lineage, were now braided together. Whoever this child was, he would be both the heir of David and the very presence of God. This was a lot to put on a single coming person. It was almost too much, and Isaiah's contemporaries struggled with it, because Isaiah did not simply describe the coming king as glorious. In other passages, he described him as despised, rejected, wounded, oppressed, killed. The same prophet who said the child would be the mighty God also said the child would be led like a lamb to the slaughter. The same prophet who said the throne of David would be his forever also said he would be cut off out of the land of the living. The picture was confusing, and for the next 7 centuries the people of Israel would argue about whether there were perhaps 2 messiahs coming, one to suffer and one to reign, because they could not understand how a single person could be both at once. Around the same time Isaiah was speaking in Jerusalem, another prophet was speaking in the countryside south of the city. His name was Micah, and he was, by his own description, a countryman. He was not a courtier like Isaiah. He came from a small town called Morsheth, out in the Judean foothills, and his prophecies have the smell of the soil on them. He spoke about the rich oppressing the poor, about the corruption of the courts, about merchants who used dishonest scales. He thundered against injustice in the same way the country prophets had always thundered. But in the middle of his short book, in the 5th chapter, Micah suddenly looked away from the present and into the future, and he gave the messianic prophecy an address. But thou, Bethlehem Ephratah, though thou be little among the thousands of Judah, yet out of thee shall he come forth unto me, that is to be ruler in Israel, whose goings forth have been from of old, from everlasting. That single sentence is one of the most quietly devastating prophecies ever given. Bethlehem Ephratah. Not the great city of Jerusalem, not the proud cities of Samaria or Hebron, not any of the centers of religious or political power, but a tiny village in the hill country, a place so small that Micah himself acknowledges its smallness in the same breath he gives it its destiny. Bethlehem, in the 8th century before Christ, was a backwater. It had a small population, no significant industry, no political weight. Its only claim to fame was that David had been born there, but David had moved out long ago and reigned in Jerusalem. To say that the ruler of Israel, the one whose goings forth had been from everlasting, would come out of Bethlehem was to commit in advance to a very specific geographical pin on a very specific map. And notice the second half of Micah's prophecy, whose goings forth have been from of old, from everlasting. That is not a description of an ordinary king. Kings have a beginning. They are born, they grow up, they take the throne, they die. To say that this coming ruler had goings forth from everlasting, from eternity, is to say that he existed before he was born. It is to say, in language a Hebrew of the 8th century before Christ would have understood, that this ruler was not merely human. Micah, like Isaiah, was reaching for words that the Hebrew vocabulary did not quite have, trying to describe a coming person who was somehow both man and more than man, both born in time and existing from before time. The country prophet from Morsheth had agreed, without ever consulting him, with the courtier prophet from Jerusalem. The seed of the woman would be born in a small town. He would be God in human form. He would sit on David's throne. He would somehow be both wounded and victorious. The threads kept multiplying. Other prophets added their own details over the next several centuries. Hosea spoke of the Messiah being called out of Egypt, in a sentence whose original context was about the nation of Israel, but which would, in time, find a second and more specific fulfillment. Zechariah said the king would come riding into Jerusalem on the foal of a donkey, lowly and yet a king, an image so specific and so visually arresting that no one could miss it when it finally happened. He also said the king would be sold for 30 pieces of silver, and that the money would be thrown into the house of the Lord and used to buy a potter's field, a prophecy so absurdly specific in its detail that no later forgery could account for it. Malachi, the very last prophet of the Hebrew Bible, said that a messenger would come before the Messiah to prepare his way, a forerunner crying in the wilderness. By the time the last prophet laid down his pen, the messianic portrait had been built up, line by line, generation by generation, into a composite so detailed that it could not have been reverse engineered by any committee. The seed would be born of a virgin in Bethlehem, of the line of Judah and of David. He would be both human and divine. He would be preceded by a messenger. He would ride into Jerusalem on a donkey. He would be sold for 30 pieces of silver. He would be wounded for the sins of his people. He would be cut off out of the land of the living. He would crush the head of the serpent. He would sit on David's throne forever. The picture was not finished, but the bones of it were laid out in such detail that anyone who eventually fit the picture would be unmistakable, and anyone who did not fit it could be safely ruled out. And then the prophets fell silent. For 400 years, between the last of the Hebrew prophets and the dawn of the 1st century after Christ, no canonical prophet rose in Israel. The intertestamental period, as it came to be called, was a long, dark stretch of foreign occupation, of Persian and then Greek and then Roman dominance, of the rise and fall of the Maccabean revolt, of corrupt high priests and political compromises and waiting. The people of Israel kept reading the old scrolls. They kept circling the same verses. They kept watching the road to Bethlehem, the road from Egypt, the gate by which the king would enter Jerusalem. They were, by the time the silence finally broke, exhausted with watching. When the silence did break, it broke in an unexpected place and to an unexpected person. A teenage girl in a town that was not Bethlehem, a girl who was probably no older than 15 or 16, was visited by an angel. The town was Nazareth, in the despised northern province of Galilee, a place so insignificant that one of the first reactions to her son's later ministry would be the snarled question, "Can any good thing come out of Nazareth?" The girl's name was Mary, and she was engaged to a carpenter named Joseph. The angel, whose name was Gabriel, the same Gabriel who had once stood before Daniel by the river Ulai, told her that she would conceive a son, that she should call his name Jesus, that he would be great, that he would be called the Son of the Highest, that the Lord God would give unto him the throne of his father David, and that of his kingdom there would be no end. Mary asked the only sensible question, "How shall this be, seeing I know not a man?" She was, in other words, a virgin, and she said so plainly. The angel answered, "The Holy Ghost shall come upon thee, and the power of the Highest shall overshadow thee." The girl did not run. She did not laugh, the way Sarah had laughed 2,000 years earlier. She did not bargain. She simply said, "Behold the handmaid of the Lord, be it unto me according to thy word." And in that sentence, the silence of 4 centuries broke, and the seed promised in the garden began at last to take human form inside her. The complications came almost immediately. Mary was engaged, but not yet married, which meant her unexplained pregnancy was a scandal that could have ended her life. Joseph, the carpenter, was a decent man, and his first instinct was to break off the engagement quietly, to spare her public shame. An angel visited him in a dream and told him otherwise. "Joseph, thou son of David, fear not to take unto thee Mary thy wife, for that which is conceived in her is of the Holy Ghost." Joseph obeyed. He took her into his home. The scandal must have been considerable, and the whispers must have followed both of them for the rest of their lives. People knew when a baby was born too soon. People counted. Then, late in the pregnancy, came the decree from Caesar Augustus that all the world should be taxed, and that every man should return to the city of his ancestors to be registered. Joseph, of the line of David, had to travel from Nazareth to Bethlehem. He could not have left his pregnant wife alone in Nazareth, not in her condition, not with the gossip swirling, so she went with him. The journey was about 90 miles on foot, or more likely partly on a donkey, through hill country and across the Jordan Valley, and by the time they arrived in Bethlehem, the town was crowded with other descendants of David doing exactly the same thing. There was no room in any of the inns. They ended up sheltering with the animals, in a stable or perhaps in the lower level of a house where livestock was kept overnight, and that is where the baby was born. He was wrapped in strips of cloth and laid in a feeding trough, because there was nowhere else to put him. Out in the surrounding fields, shepherds were keeping watch over their flocks by night. These were not romantic figures. They were rough men, often considered ritually unclean because their work made it impossible to keep the ceremonial laws, and yet they were the first to be told that the seed of the woman had finally arrived. An angel appeared, then a multitude of angels, and the sky above the Bethlehem hills filled with light and singing. "Unto you is born this day, in the city of David, a Savior, which is Christ the Lord." The shepherds went and saw, and they spread the news, and the news must have struck the people who heard it as the wild fancy of frightened men. But the baby was real. The town was the right town. The line was the right line. The mother was a virgin. The name Emmanuel fit. Every thread that the prophets had been weaving across 2,000 years of Hebrew history converged on a feeding trough in a borrowed stable in a small town that had once been famous only for producing a shepherd king. And somewhere in the dark beyond the stable, if you believe the older parts of the story, a serpent felt the first hairline crack in the dome of his ancient confidence. The seed of the woman had been born, and the head wound, though decades away, had begun. The years that followed are reported only sparingly. There was a visit from foreign astronomers, men from the East who had been watching the skies and had noticed a star that they read as the announcement of a Jewish king. They came to Jerusalem, they asked at the palace, and they sent the paranoid king Herod the Great into a spiral of murderous panic. Herod consulted his own scribes about where the Christ was to be born, and his own scribes told him plainly, "Bethlehem of Judea, for thus it is written by the prophet." They quoted Micah. They quoted him correctly. They knew the prophecy, they had read it for centuries, and they could give the answer without even looking it up. The wise men found the child, presented their gifts, and were warned in a dream not to return to Herod. Herod, when he realized he had been outmaneuvered, ordered the slaughter of every male child in Bethlehem under 2 years old, a horror so terrible that one of the older prophecies, the one Jeremiah had spoken about Rachel weeping for her children, took on a fresh and grievous fulfillment. Joseph, warned in another dream, had already taken the family and fled to Egypt. They stayed there until Herod died. Then they came back, and Hosea's old line about the Messiah being called out of Egypt was quietly checked off the list. The boy grew up in Nazareth. He learned the carpenter's trade. He went to the synagogue and read the scrolls. He traveled with his family to Jerusalem for the great feasts, and when he was 12 years old, he stayed behind in the temple, debating with the teachers, asking questions that astonished them, and when his frantic parents found him after 3 days, he told them, "Wist ye not that I must be about my Father's business?" For the next 18 years he disappeared into ordinary life, working with his hands, almost certainly burying his stepfather Joseph somewhere in those years, since Joseph drops out of the narrative entirely. And then, when he was about 30 years old, the messenger that Malachi had promised, the forerunner crying in the wilderness, appeared on the banks of the Jordan River, dressed in camel's hair, eating locusts and wild honey, baptizing people for the remission of sins. His name was John. He was Mary's cousin's son. And one day a man walked down out of the crowd toward the water, and John, who had been preaching to thousands, looked up and stopped mid-sentence and said, "Behold the Lamb of God, which taketh away the sin of the world." The seed of the woman was now 30 years old, and ready to begin the work for which the prophets had been waiting, the kings had been waiting, the women keeping watch over their cradles for 40 centuries had been waiting. He stepped into the river, was baptized by his cousin, and the heavens opened, and a voice said, "This is my beloved Son, in whom I am well pleased." The Spirit descended on him in the form of a dove. The garden whisper, the Abrahamic promise, the Judah blessing, the Davidic covenant, the Isaiah oracle, the Micah address. Every line that had been deposited in the long account of Scripture was now standing in human form on the banks of the Jordan, dripping wet, about to walk into a wilderness for 40 days of fasting and temptation, after which he would walk back out again and start announcing that the kingdom of heaven was at hand. The promise made to a snake in a ruined garden, in 17 words, was now fully embodied in a young Galilean carpenter standing in the river. The seed had come. The head of the serpent was on borrowed time, and the heel that would be wounded was, for the moment, still unscarred. But the wound was waiting. It had been waiting for centuries, waiting in the scrolls of the prophets, waiting in the songs of the temple, waiting in the very phrases that the people of Israel sang every Sabbath without realizing what they were singing. The man who had just stepped out of the Jordan River with the water still running down his beard was walking, whether the crowd knew it or not, toward an appointment that had been written down in extraordinary detail 700 years before he was born. And the most painful part of that appointment, the part the prophets had agonized over, the part the rabbis had argued about for generations, was that the coming Messiah was not going to be received as a king. He was going to be tortured to death like a criminal. And somehow, in some way, the prophets themselves did not fully grasp that torture was the entire point. To understand the scandal of this, you have to understand what the people of Israel were expecting. They were expecting a deliverer, yes, but they were expecting a deliverer with a sword in his hand. They had been waiting under one foreign occupier after another for almost 600 years by the time Jesus was born. The Babylonians had conquered them, then the Persians, then the Greeks, then the Romans. They had been pushed around, taxed, garrisoned, executed, and stripped of self-rule for so long that they had built up a rich literature of expectation around what the Messiah would do when he finally came. He would raise an army. He would drive the foreigners out. He would reestablish the throne of David in Jerusalem. He would crush the enemies of Israel under his heel and reign in glory. There was a whole genre of Jewish writing, the apocalyptic literature of the centuries between the Testaments, that pictured the coming king in exactly these terms: glorious, triumphant, vindicating his people, wreathed in light, riding a war horse, not a donkey. But the prophets, when you read them carefully, had said something stranger than that. They had said two things, and the two things did not seem to fit together. They had said the Messiah would come in glory, yes, but they had also said, in passages that the synagogue skipped over uncomfortably, and the rabbis explained in elaborate ways, that he would come in shame. He would come bleeding. He would come bearing the sins of his people in his own body. He would come as a lamb led to the slaughter. The same prophet who described the throne of David being established forever also described that same coming king as a man of sorrows, acquainted with grief, despised and rejected, a man from whom people would hide their faces. The two pictures could not be reconciled by anyone reading the texts before the events. They could only be reconciled afterwards by people standing on the other side of a cross. The most extraordinary of these passages, the one that has caused more arguments and conversions than perhaps any other section of the Hebrew Bible, sits in the middle of the book of Isaiah. The man who wrote it was the same Isaiah who had told King Ahaz about the virgin and the Emmanuel child, the same Isaiah who had described the mighty God-child whose government would have no end. That Isaiah, the courtier prophet of Jerusalem, the man who had walked the streets of the city for half a century in the 8th century before Christ, somewhere along the way received another vision. And the vision he received in this case was so jarring, so utterly out of keeping with anything else the messianic literature was producing, that he must have hesitated before writing it down. He did write it down. The passage runs from the last 3 verses of his 52nd chapter through to the end of his 53rd chapter, and it is 15 verses of such piercing detail that, when you read it without telling people where it comes from, they almost always assume it is a description of the crucifixion of Jesus written after the fact by one of the gospel writers. It is not. It was written more than 7 centuries before the crucifixion. The Dead Sea Scrolls, discovered in caves above the western shore of the Dead Sea between 1947 and 1956, contain a complete copy of Isaiah, and that copy has been carbon dated to roughly 100 years before Christ. So whatever else can be said about Isaiah's 53rd chapter, it cannot be said that it was written after the events. It was certainly in existence, in its current form, before the events. Read it slowly. He is despised and rejected of men, a man of sorrows, and acquainted with grief, and we hid, as it were, our faces from him. He was despised, and we esteemed him not. That is the opening note. The servant, as Isaiah calls him, is not glorious to look upon. He does not come surrounded by a court of admirers. He comes alone, and he comes with grief written on his face, the kind of grief that makes other people uncomfortable, the kind of grief that makes you cross to the other side of the street so you do not have to make eye contact. People look at him and look away. They write him off. They do not see anything in him that would make them follow him. We esteemed him not. That sentence alone destroys every triumphant warrior king theory the rabbis had built up. The servant of the Lord, when he comes, is going to be a man people do not even bother to esteem. Then the picture sharpens. Surely he hath borne our griefs, and carried our sorrows. Yet we did esteem him stricken, smitten of God, and afflicted. Notice the careful turn of that sentence. The people who saw him assumed his suffering was deserved. They thought God was punishing him for some sin of his own. Stricken, smitten of God, and afflicted. This is what the watching crowd would conclude. This is what the priests and the scribes and the soldiers would say at the foot of his cross. He must have done something. He must have deserved it. God would not let an innocent man suffer like this. But Isaiah is telling us, in advance, that the watching crowd will be wrong. The servant is suffering, but he is not suffering for his own sins. He is bearing their griefs and carrying their sorrows. The pronouns matter. Our griefs, our sorrows, our transgressions, our iniquities. The next verse drives the point home with a force that has not weakened in 2,700 years. But he was wounded for our transgressions. He was bruised for our iniquities. The chastisement of our peace was upon him, and with his stripes we are healed. Wounded, bruised, chastised, striped. 4 physical words for 4 kinds of physical injury, and each one of them piled onto a man who is taking on himself the sins of the people watching. The Hebrew word translated wounded is one of the strongest words in the Hebrew language for physical violence. It means pierced through, run through, fatally injured. The word for bruised means crushed. The word for stripes means the marks left on a body by a whip. Not a metaphor, a literal scourging, a literal piercing, a literal crushing. 700 years before the Roman scourge had been invented in the form it would take in the 1st century after Christ, before the cross had been refined into the particular instrument the Romans would use, before any of the specifics of Jesus' death had been arranged on the calendar of human events. Isaiah was describing a man being pierced and crushed and whipped, and was insisting that the pain belonged to others. All we like sheep have gone astray. We have turned every one to his own way, and the Lord hath laid on him the iniquity of us all, every one to his own way. The Lord has laid the sins of all of us on this one man. This is one of the densest theological statements in the entire Hebrew Bible. It is not a guess. It is not a possibility. It is a flat declaration that the servant of the Lord, when he comes, will be made the carrier of every individual sin of every wandering sheep in the whole long history of human disobedience. The single shoulders of one servant will hold the accumulated weight of every transgression. The accountancy of God in this passage is being settled on a single ledger. Then the silence comes. He was oppressed, and he was afflicted, yet he opened not his mouth. He is brought as a lamb to the slaughter, and as a sheep before her shearers is dumb, so he openeth not his mouth. Stop on that for a moment. Anyone who has ever watched a sheep being sheared has seen that strange, unnatural calm. The sheep does not fight. It does not bleat. It surrenders to the hands holding the shears. Anyone who has ever watched a lamb being led to slaughter has seen the same thing. The animal goes quietly. It does not understand what is happening to it, or perhaps it does, and there is nothing to be done. Isaiah is telling us that the servant, when his own moment comes, will go silent. He will not defend himself. He will not argue with his accusers. He will not call down vengeance on the people doing this to him. He will be as quiet as a lamb walking past the smell of its own blood toward the knife. This silence, this refusal to speak in his own defense, became one of the most striking details about the trial of Jesus 7 centuries later. He stood before the high priest Caiaphas, who shouted accusations at him, and he said almost nothing. He stood before Pontius Pilate, the Roman governor, who marveled at his refusal to answer the charges and asked him directly, "Answerest thou nothing?" Behold, how many things they witness against thee. But Jesus answered him not a word, insomuch that the governor marveled greatly. He stood before Herod Antipas, who had wanted to see him for years, who hoped to be entertained by some miracle, and Jesus would not even speak to him. The silence was so total, so unnatural, so contrary to the way condemned men ordinarily behaved, that it stuck in the memory of the people who watched it. They remembered. They wrote it down. And the rabbis who had been reading Isaiah's 53rd chapter for centuries, the rabbis who had been arguing about who the silent servant was supposed to be, suddenly had something to look at. Isaiah keeps going. He was taken from prison and from judgment, and who shall declare his generation? For he was cut off out of the land of the living, for the transgression of my people was he stricken. He was taken from prison and from judgment. He was cut off out of the land of the living. The Hebrew phrase translated cut off is the same phrase used for execution, for the violent severing of a life from the community. It is not a death of natural causes. It is not the long, peaceful close of an old man's days. It is a sudden, judicial, public removal. For the transgression of my people was he stricken. Once again, the pronoun matters. He was killed for the transgression of my people. The word my in that sentence comes out of the mouth of God himself. It is God speaking, identifying the people, claiming responsibility for the transgression that the servant is dying for. And then comes the verse that broke the rabbi's theories most sharply. And he made his grave with the wicked, and with the rich in his death, because he had done no violence, neither was any deceit in his mouth. Read that line carefully. He made his grave with the wicked, and with the rich in his death. He died as a criminal, executed alongside criminals, but he was buried in the tomb of a rich man. Two contradictory burial details, both predicted in advance, both fulfilled within hours of one another. Jesus was crucified between two thieves on the Roman execution ground outside the city wall, and that satisfied the first half of the prophecy. He died with the wicked, in the manner of the wicked, treated as the wicked. But within hours of his death, before sundown on the same Friday, a wealthy member of the Sanhedrin named Joseph of Arimathea went to Pontius Pilate and asked for the body of Jesus. Joseph was rich. The gospel writers go out of their way to mention this detail, and you can almost feel them flipping back to Isaiah's 53rd chapter as they write. Joseph took the body, wrapped it in fine linen, and laid it in his own new tomb, a tomb hewn out of the rock, in which no man had ever been laid before, with the rich in his death. The phrase fit. The man buried in the rich man's tomb had also been hung between thieves. Both halves of the prophecy were satisfied within a few hours of each other by the actions of completely different people who could not possibly have coordinated. The chapter continues, and the theological weight of it gets even heavier. Yet it pleased the Lord to bruise him. He hath put him to grief. When thou shalt make his soul an offering for sin, he shall see his seed, he shall prolong his days, and the pleasure of the Lord shall prosper in his hand. Make his soul an offering for sin. The servant himself, the man pierced and crushed and silenced, is going to be the offering. He is the Lamb. He is what is on the altar. The whole sacrificial system of Israel, every lamb slaughtered at every Passover for 1,500 years, every bullock burned on the great altar in front of the temple, every sin offering and trespass offering and peace offering ever lifted up by every priest in every generation was a shadow being cast backwards from this one moment. The servant was the substance. The lambs had been pictures. He was the lamb that all the other lambs had been pointing at, and Isaiah is saying it out loud, in advance, in the middle of the 8th century before Christ. He shall see of the travail of his soul, and shall be satisfied. By his knowledge shall my righteous servant justify many, for he shall bear their iniquities. And then the closing verse, perhaps the strangest of them all. Therefore will I divide him a portion with the great, and he shall divide the spoil with the strong. Because he hath poured out his soul unto death, and he was numbered with the transgressors. And he bare the sin of many, and made intercession for the transgressors. He bare the sin of many. He poured out his soul unto death. He was numbered with the transgressors. He made intercession for them. He prayed for the very people killing him. 700 years before Calvary, before a Galilean carpenter looked down from a cross at the Roman soldiers gambling for his clothes and said, "Father, forgive them, for they know not what they do," Isaiah had written that the servant would make intercession for the transgressors. The prayer was waiting. It had been waiting in the text for 7 centuries. And when the moment came, the servant said exactly what the prophet had said he would say. But Isaiah was not the only voice describing the death of the Messiah in advance. 3 centuries before Isaiah even picked up his pen, in the 10th century before Christ, the shepherd King David, the same David from whose line the Messiah would come, sat in his palace and wrote a poem so precise in its anticipation of crucifixion that it has stunned readers ever since. The poem is now numbered as the 22nd of the 150 Psalms. It opens with a cry that anyone who has heard the gospel narratives will recognize immediately. My God, why hast thou forsaken me?" That single sentence in the original Hebrew is Eli, Eli, lama sabachthani. And it is the sentence that Jesus, dying on the cross, hanging in the dark of the 9th hour with the noon sun blacked out of the sky, cried out so loudly that the people standing at the foot of the cross misheard it and thought he was calling for Elijah. He was not calling for Elijah. He was quoting Psalm 22. For a Jew of the 1st century, quoting the opening line of a psalm was a way of pointing to the entire psalm, the way an Englishman might say, "Once more unto the breach," and assume the listener knows the rest of the speech. By crying out the first verse of Psalm 22, the dying Jesus was pointing the entire watching crowd back to the rest of the psalm, asking them in effect to read it again with new eyes. So read it. Read what David wrote in the 10th century before Christ. "I am poured out like water, and all my bones are out of joint. My heart is like wax. It is melted in the midst of my bowels. My strength is dried up like a potsherd, and my tongue cleaveth to my jaws. And thou hast brought me into the dust of death, bones out of joint." That is what crucifixion does to a man. The body's own weight, hanging from the arms, pulls the shoulders out of their sockets. Heart like wax, strength dried up, tongue stuck to the jaws from the dehydration of hours of exposure to the sun. Brought into the dust of death, every detail accurate. And David, when he wrote this psalm, was not describing crucifixion. He could not have been. Crucifixion as a method of execution did not exist yet. The Romans had not yet invented the modern form of the cross. The Persians used something like it, but in a different shape. The Babylonians and the Assyrians used impalement on stakes. None of the methods of public execution available to the Hebrew imagination in the 10th century before Christ matched what David was describing. He was describing something that would not be standardized as an execution method for another 7 centuries. And yet the description fits. It gets worse, or, depending on how you look at it, more remarkable. "For dogs have compassed me. The assembly of the wicked have enclosed me. They pierced my hands and my feet." They pierced my hands and my feet. There is no other form of execution in the ancient world that involves piercing the hands and the feet. None. The Hebrews stoned. The Greeks poisoned or threw down cliffs. The Babylonians threw into furnaces or lions' dens. The Assyrians flayed. The Egyptians beheaded. Only crucifixion involves piercing the hands and the feet. And crucifixion in its developed form was a Roman innovation that came hundreds of years after David. The line stands in the psalm like a piece of evidence that nobody before the 1st century knew what to do with. Some Hebrew copyists, encountering it, even tried to alter the word, claiming it should be read as like a lion rather than they pierced, but the older manuscripts, including the Greek Septuagint translation, made 2 centuries before Christ, all read pierced. The original word stands. The psalm goes on, "I may tell all my bones. They look and stare upon me. They part my garments among them, and cast lots upon my vesture. They part my garments, they cast lots upon my vesture." Now, the picture sharpens to an even finer point. Roman law gave the soldiers conducting an execution the right to take the personal effects of the condemned man as their pay. By the time Jesus was crucified, this practice was so standardized that the 4-soldier execution detail had a settled procedure for dividing up the goods. Jesus had been wearing several garments. There was an outer cloak, there were sandals, there was a belt or sash, and there was an inner tunic. The 4 soldiers divided the 4 ordinary items among themselves, 1 to each. But the inner tunic of Jesus, as it happened, was woven in one piece without seam from top to bottom, the kind of garment that cannot be torn into 4 pieces without ruining it. So the soldiers, sitting at the foot of the cross with the dying man above them, said to one another, "Let us not rend it, but cast lots for it, whose it shall be." They threw dice, they cast lots. They divided the 4 ordinary garments, and they cast lots for the seamless one. And they did it without ever knowing that they were acting out, with bored Roman soldierly indifference, the exact final gesture of a poem written by a Jewish king 1,000 years earlier. "I am a reproach of men, and despised of the people. All they that see me laugh me to scorn. They shoot out the lip, they shake the head, saying, He trusted on the Lord that he would deliver him. Let him deliver him, seeing he delighted in him." Read that line again. They shake their heads, saying, "He trusted on the Lord that he would deliver him. Let him deliver him." Now read what the Gospel of Matthew records the chief priests and elders saying as they passed by the cross of Jesus. "He trusted in God. Let him deliver him now, if he will have him." Almost word for word. The mockers at the cross, in the 1st century after Christ, were quoting Psalm 22 without realizing they were quoting it. They were standing inside an ancient script, reading their lines, playing parts that had been written for them 10 centuries before they were born. And the man on the cross above them was looking down at the entire scene unfolding exactly as the psalm had said it would, and he had cried out the opening line, and now the rest of it was being acted out around him by the very people taunting him. This is the thing about prophecy that catches the breath. It is not just that the events come true. It is that the people involved in the events are, without knowing it, fulfilling the prophecies themselves, often by the very actions they take to oppose the man the prophecies are about. The chief priests who handed Jesus over to be crucified did so because they wanted to silence him, not because they wanted to confirm Isaiah and David. The Roman soldiers who pierced his hands and feet did so because that was the standard procedure, not because they had read the Psalms. The mockers who shook their heads and quoted, "Let him deliver him," were trying to humiliate a dying man, not trying to enact a 1,000-year-old liturgy. And yet between them, by their actions, they checked off prophecy after prophecy in real time, with the dying man watching, with the centurion in charge of the execution standing nearby, with the women weeping at a distance, with the sun darkening at noon, and the curtain of the temple tearing from top to bottom in the moment of his death. Other prophecies were being fulfilled at the same time, smaller details that had been embedded in Scripture for centuries, and that all converged on the same 6 hours on the same Friday afternoon. The prophet Zechariah, writing in the 6th century before Christ, in the period after the Babylonian exile, had said 2 things that bear directly on the death of the Messiah. The first was that the Messiah would be sold for 30 pieces of silver, and that the silver would be thrown into the house of the Lord and used to buy a potter's field. "And I said unto them, If ye think good, give me my price, and if not, forbear. So they weighed for my price 30 pieces of silver. And the Lord said unto me, Cast it unto the potter, a goodly price that I was prized at of them. And I took the 30 pieces of silver, and cast them to the potter in the house of the Lord. That oracle sat in the book of Zechariah for 500 years. It made no obvious sense. Why 30 pieces of silver? Why thrown to the potter? Why in the house of the Lord? Nobody could explain it. Then in the 1st century after Christ, one of the 12 disciples of Jesus, a man named Judas Iscariot, the keeper of the disciples' money bag, went to the chief priests and asked, What will ye give me? And I will deliver him unto you. And they covenanted with him for 30 pieces of silver, the exact amount, the same number Zechariah had specified 5 centuries earlier. Judas led the temple guards to the garden where Jesus was praying, identified him with a kiss, and saw him arrested and led away to trial. By the next morning, Judas had been overcome with horror at what he had done, and he ran back to the temple with the silver in his hands and tried to give it back. The priests refused to take it. He threw the coins on the floor of the sanctuary and ran out and hanged himself. The priests, picking up the silver, were now in a strange situation. They could not put it into the temple treasury because it was technically blood money, the price of a man's life, and the law forbade such money from being added to the treasury. They held a meeting and decided to use the 30 pieces of silver to buy a particular field outside the city, a field of poor quality clay that had once been used by potters, and to use the field as a burying place for foreigners who died in Jerusalem. They threw the silver to a potter in the house of the Lord, and the potter sold them his field. The oracle of Zechariah, which had made no sense for half a millennium, was satisfied to the letter inside of 48 hours. The second oracle of Zechariah is even more piercing, because it is given in the voice of God himself. They shall look upon me whom they have pierced, and they shall mourn for him as one mourneth for his only son. Look upon me whom they have pierced, spoken by God of God. Look upon me whom they have pierced. There is no other passage in the Hebrew Bible quite like it. It depicts a moment when the people of Israel will look up at someone they have pierced, and that someone will be God, and they will mourn the way you mourn for an only son, the deepest grief a Jewish family knew. Zechariah did not explain it. He could not. He simply wrote it down. And on a Friday afternoon, 6 centuries later, a Roman soldier named Longinus, according to one of the older traditions, stood beside a cross on the hill of Golgotha and, to make sure the man on the cross was dead, drove the head of his spear into the man's side. Blood and water came out together, the medical signature of a heart that has been pierced after death. The soldier had pierced the side of God. The disciple John, who was standing nearby with the dying man's mother, watched it happen, and when he wrote his gospel decades later, he quoted Zechariah and said the soldiers did not break the legs of Jesus, that the scripture should be fulfilled. A bone of him shall not be broken, and they shall look on him whom they pierced. The unbroken bones, by the way, were the fulfillment of yet another set of older prophecies. The Passover lamb, every year for 1,500 years, had been slaughtered with a specific ritual instruction. Not a bone of it shall be broken. That commandment had been given through Moses in Exodus and again in Numbers. The lambs of Israel had been killed without their legs being broken, year after year, century after century, with the priests being careful to follow the rule, even as the slaughter grew industrial in scale during the great festivals. And on the very day of Passover, with thousands of lambs being killed in the temple courts under the same ancient rule, the Roman soldiers came to the cross of Jesus to break his legs and hasten his death, because the Sabbath was approaching, and the bodies could not be left up after sundown. They broke the legs of the 2 thieves on the crosses beside him. But when they came to Jesus, they saw that he was already dead, and they did not break his legs. They did not need to. They pierced him instead, And so 2 prophecies were fulfilled in a single act, the breaking of the bones avoided and the piercing of the side accomplished, and the symbolism of 1,500 years of Passover lambs converged on a single body, on a single cross, on a single Friday afternoon. The scandal of all this, for the people of the first century, was almost unbearable. A Messiah was supposed to triumph. A Messiah was supposed to ride into Jerusalem in glory and overthrow the Roman occupation. A Messiah was not supposed to be tortured to death like a slave. The cross, in the Roman world, was the most degrading form of execution that could be inflicted upon a human being. It was reserved for slaves, foreigners, and rebels. Roman citizens were exempt from it because it was considered too shameful for any free Roman to endure. The very word for cross was so distasteful in polite Roman conversation that orators avoided it. To die on a cross was to die in the deepest possible disgrace, naked, slowly, exposed to the public gaze, with your humiliation displayed for hours or even days, with passers-by spitting and mocking, and the local birds picking at you from above. For a Jew, it was even worse. The book of Deuteronomy contained a sentence that hung over the whole notion of crucifixion like a curse. He that is hanged is accursed of God. Anyone hung on a tree, or by extension on any wooden structure, was understood to be under the curse of God. So when Jesus of Nazareth was nailed to a Roman cross, the watching Jewish crowd had 2 reasons to consider the matter settled. He was being executed by the Romans as a criminal, and he was also being placed under the explicit curse of the Hebrew Bible. He could not possibly be the Messiah. The Messiah was to be exalted. This man was being crushed. The Messiah was to wear a crown of gold. This man wore a crown of thorns. The Messiah was to be enthroned in glory. This man was enthroned on a wooden beam. Nothing about the picture fit. Nothing, that is, except the inconvenient passages from Isaiah and from David's Psalms and from Zechariah and from a dozen other places in the prophets that the people had been quietly skipping over for centuries because they could not be made to harmonize with the warrior king version of the messianic hope. Now those inconvenient passages were the only ones that fit. The triumphant ones did not yet. What the early followers of Jesus came to understand in the days and weeks and years after the crucifixion was that the prophets had not been wrong about either picture. The triumphant Messiah and the suffering servant were not 2 separate people. They were the same person in 2 different visits. The first time, he came as the lamb. The second time, when he comes again, he will come as the lion. The prophets had seen both pictures, but they had seen them stacked one on top of the other, like 2 photographs taken from different angles laid on top of each other, and they had not been able to tell which was the foreground and which was the background. They had simply written down what they saw and trusted that someone, eventually, would be able to separate the layers. The cross separated them. The cross was the moment when the suffering servant prophecies came to flesh and the throne of David prophecies were placed on hold for a future date. But that future date is the subject of another prophecy entirely, given to a different prophet in a different city, under a different empire, several centuries after Isaiah, in a court so foreign and so far from Jerusalem that nobody listening to him in his own day could have imagined him daring to write down what he wrote down. He was a young Hebrew aristocrat who had been carried off as a hostage from Jerusalem when the city fell to the Babylonians. He was given a foreign name and a foreign education. He served 4 kings of 2 empires. He survived a den of lions. He rose to the highest office in the land, and from the windows of his Babylonian palace on the banks of the Tigris, he received a vision that calculated to the exact year when the Messiah would arrive and when the Messiah would be cut off. The man on the cross, the man who had just stopped breathing, the man whose side had just been pierced by the Roman spear, had arrived and been cut off precisely on the schedule that the young aristocrat in Babylon had been shown 573 years before he was born. To understand how that schedule came to be, you have to go back across the centuries and across the desert to a city built on the wide brown waters of the Euphrates, a city of glazed blue tile and ziggurats climbing toward heaven, a city whose name in its own language meant the Gate of God, Babylon, the most beautiful and the most terrible capital the ancient world had ever produced. Walls so wide that 2 chariots could race side by side along the top, gardens that climbed in tiers toward the sky, and that the Greeks would later remember as one of the 7 wonders of the world. A king on the throne whose ambition had broken every rival, and who had brought back, as part of his accumulating wealth, a small group of teenage boys taken from the royal families of a conquered kingdom in the far west. The year was around 605 before Christ. The conquered kingdom was Judah, the southern half of what had once been the United Kingdom of Israel. The conquering king was Nebuchadnezzar II, the most formidable monarch Babylon had ever produced. And one of the teenage hostages, dragged in chains across the 800 miles of desert and farmland that separated Jerusalem from Babylon, was a young man whose Hebrew name was Daniel, which means God is my judge, and whose Babylonian captors quickly renamed him Belteshazzar, which means Bel protect his life, after one of the Babylonian gods. He was probably about 15 years old when they took him. He was educated, well-bred, the son of a Judean noble family, and the Babylonians had a program for boys like him. They were to be trained for 3 years in the language and literature of the Chaldeans, fattened on the food and wine from the king's own table, and groomed for service in the imperial bureaucracy. The empire ate clever boys for breakfast. Daniel kept the dietary laws of his fathers. He refused the king's meat and the king's wine, on the grounds that they had been offered to Babylonian idols, and he persuaded the official in charge of him to give him only vegetables and water. The official was nervous about this, because if the Hebrew boys came out of their training looking thin and sickly, the official's own head would roll. But Daniel and his 3 friends, after 10 days of pulse and water, looked healthier than the boys eating from the king's table. So they were allowed to keep their diet, and after 3 years they were brought before the king for examination, and Nebuchadnezzar found them 10 times wiser than all the magicians and astrologers in his court. Daniel had begun his career. For the rest of his very long life, this Hebrew exile would walk the corridors of 2 empires. He would interpret a dream that Nebuchadnezzar himself could not even remember, describing in advance the succession of 4 world powers that would follow Babylon. He would interpret the writing on the wall on the night Babylon fell to the Persians, and he would survive the transition because his reputation was so great that the new conquerors kept him on. He would be thrown into a pit full of starved lions by a jealous group of Persian satraps, and would walk out the next morning untouched, the lions sitting around him like cats around a stove. He would serve under Cyrus the Great, the Persian liberator, who allowed the first wave of Jewish exiles to return to Jerusalem. He would die in his 90s, still in Persia, never having seen his homeland again. Through all of this, in the long, stretching loneliness of an exile that lasted his entire adult life, he kept his window open toward Jerusalem and prayed 3 times a day toward the city he could not see. It was in the first year of the reign of Darius the Mede, after the fall of Babylon, when Daniel was an old man, that he made a discovery that changed the course of biblical prophecy. He was reading, as he often did, the older Hebrew prophets, and he was reading specifically the book of Jeremiah. Jeremiah had been a prophet in Jerusalem during the years just before its destruction, and Jeremiah had written in 2 different places that the captivity of the Jews in Babylon would last 70 years. Daniel did the arithmetic. He counted from the year of his own deportation, around 605 before Christ, and he realized that the 70 years were almost up. The captivity on Jeremiah's calendar was nearly over. The exiles were about to be sent home. This realization overwhelmed him. He set his face toward Jerusalem, put on sackcloth and ashes, and prayed one of the longest and most heart-wrenching prayers recorded anywhere in Scripture. He confessed, on behalf of his entire nation, every sin that had brought them into exile. He pleaded with God to look upon the desolation of the holy city and the destruction of the temple. He asked, plainly and without any decoration, that the Lord would now act, that the prophesied 70 years had run their course, and that the time had come for restoration. While he was still praying, while the words were still on his lips, an angel arrived. The angel was Gabriel, the same Gabriel who would, almost 6 centuries later, stand in front of a young woman in Nazareth and tell her she would conceive a son. Gabriel touched Daniel and told him not to be afraid, that he had been sent to give him understanding. At the beginning of thy supplications the commandment came forth, and I am come to show thee, for thou art greatly beloved. Therefore understand the matter and consider the vision. Daniel, the loneliest man in the Persian Empire, was greatly beloved. The phrase appears nowhere else in the Hebrew Bible attached to a single person in quite that way. He had been seen, he had been heard, and now he was about to be given a piece of information that would settle the architecture of biblical history for the next 25 centuries. What Gabriel said next was so dense, so packed with calendar arithmetic and historical reference, that whole books have been written about a single phrase of it. The whole oracle is only 4 verses long, but those 4 verses have probably generated more theological argument than any other 4 verses in the Hebrew Bible. They are the prophecy of the 70 weeks, and they sit in the 9th chapter of the book of Daniel, near the end of the book, after the visions of the great statue and the 4 beasts, but before the visions of the wars of the kings of the north and the south. Listen to it the way Daniel heard it, in the dust and the ashes of his prayer, with the angel standing over him. 70 weeks are determined upon thy people and upon thy holy city, to finish the transgression, and to make an end of sins, and to make reconciliation for iniquity, and to bring in everlasting righteousness, and to seal up the vision and prophecy, and to anoint the most holy. That was the headline. 70 weeks. 6 things to be accomplished. The Hebrew word translated weeks is shabuim, and it does not mean weeks of 7 days the way we use the word. It means sevens, units of 7. The context determines whether the unit is days or years. Daniel had been thinking about Jeremiah's 70 years. The unit on his mind was years. Gabriel was now answering him in units of 7 years each, 70 weeks of years, 490 years. 6 things would be accomplished within those 490 years. The transgression would be finished. An end would be made of sins. Reconciliation would be made for iniquity. Everlasting righteousness would be brought in. The vision and prophecy would be sealed up, and the most holy would be anointed. Notice the gravity of those 6 items. They are not bookkeeping notes. They are the stages of cosmic redemption. They are the entire program of God for dealing with sin and putting the universe back together. Daniel was being told that within 490 years, all 6 of those things would happen on a calendar that would begin with a specific event and end with another specific event. The next verse identified the starting point. Know therefore and understand that from the going forth of the commandment to restore and to build Jerusalem unto the Messiah, the prince shall be 7 weeks and 62 weeks. The street shall be built again, and the wall, even in troublous times. The starting gun would be the issuing of a commandment to restore and to build Jerusalem. From the moment that commandment went out, the clock would start. The first interval would be 7 weeks, that is, 49 years. The second interval would be 62 more weeks, that is, 434 more years. Together, those 2 intervals total 483 years. At the end of that combined 483 years, the Messiah, the Prince, would appear. Not the Messiah's birth, the Messiah's appearance, his public arrival. His presentation to Jerusalem. This was unprecedented. No prophet had ever given a date for the Messiah's arrival before. Isaiah had said the Messiah would be born of a virgin, but he had not said when. Micah had said the Messiah would be born in Bethlehem, but he had not said when. Now Gabriel, in a Persian palace in the 6th century before Christ, was giving Daniel a number. 483 years from a starting decree, the Messiah would present himself. The angel went on, "And after 62 weeks shall Messiah be cut off, but not for himself. And the people of the prince that shall come shall destroy the city and the sanctuary, and the end thereof shall be with a flood, and unto the end of the war desolations are determined. After the 62 weeks, the Messiah would be cut off." The same phrase Isaiah had used, "cut off out of the land of the living." The Messiah would be killed, and not for himself. He would be killed for someone else's sin, exactly as Isaiah had described. And then the people of a coming prince would destroy the city and the sanctuary. The sanctuary, of course, was the temple in Jerusalem. The city was Jerusalem itself. After the Messiah was cut off, the city and the temple would be destroyed. The arithmetic of this prophecy is one of the most astonishing things in Scripture, and it has been worked through by generations of careful readers. But the basic shape of it is not difficult to follow. The starting point was a decree to restore and build Jerusalem. There were several decrees issued by Persian kings during the period after the exile, but most of them dealt only with rebuilding the temple, not with rebuilding the city itself. The one that specifically authorized the restoration of Jerusalem as a city, with walls and streets, was the decree issued by King Artaxerxes Longimanus to a Jewish cupbearer named Nehemiah in the 20th year of Artaxerxes' reign. That decree was issued in the spring of 445 before Christ. Now, the years used by Daniel are prophetic years of 360 days each, the standard reckoning of the ancient Near East before the calendar was adjusted, and which is also the unit used throughout the apocalyptic literature of the Hebrew Bible. The book of Revelation, written 6 centuries after Daniel, uses the same unit. The flood narrative in Genesis uses the same unit, 12 months of 30 days each, 360 days in a year. So when Gabriel said 69 weeks of years, he meant 483 years of 360 days each, which comes to 173,880 days. If you start counting from the spring of 445 before Christ, the day Artaxerxes signed the decree, and you count forward 173,880 days, you arrive in the spring of the year 32 after Christ, give or take a few days depending on how you adjust for leap years and the precise day of the decree. And in the spring of the year 32 after Christ, on the 10th day of the Hebrew month of Nisan, a Galilean carpenter named Jesus, riding on the foal of a donkey down the Mount of Olives toward the eastern gate of Jerusalem, presented himself publicly for the first time as the Messiah of Israel. The crowd spread their cloaks before him. They cut palm branches from the trees and waved them. They cried out, "Hosanna to the Son of David! Blessed is he that cometh in the name of the Lord." It was, in the Christian calendar, the day that has come to be called Palm Sunday. It was the only time in the entire ministry of Jesus that he allowed the crowds to acclaim him publicly as king. On every other occasion he had told people to be silent about him, had withdrawn from the crowds, had insisted that his hour was not yet come. On this one day he accepted the acclamation. He rode deliberately on a donkey, fulfilling the old prophecy of Zechariah. He let them cry the words. He wept openly when he saw the city, knowing what was coming. And then he went into the temple and turned over the tables of the money changers. That day, on the count of days that began with the decree of Artaxerxes, was the 483rd year, the day Daniel had been told the Messiah, the Prince, would present himself. The angel had given the date. The carpenter had kept the appointment. And 5 days later, on a Friday afternoon outside the city wall, the Messiah was cut off, exactly as Gabriel had said he would be after the 62 weeks, exactly as Isaiah had described 7 centuries earlier, and not for himself. The mathematical precision of this is staggering, and it has caused even skeptical scholars to bend themselves into elaborate shapes to avoid the conclusion. Some have tried to argue that the book of Daniel was not really written in the 6th century before Christ, but in the 2nd century, sometime after the events of the Maccabean revolt. The argument is that the prophecies are too detailed, too specific to have been written before the events. But the 2nd century theory does not save the skeptic, because even in the 2nd century before Christ, the death and resurrection of Jesus had not yet happened. The book of Daniel was indisputably circulating in its present form by the 2nd century before Christ at the latest, because it appears in the Greek Septuagint translation made by Jewish scholars in Alexandria in the 3rd and 2nd centuries before Christ. The Dead Sea Scrolls, hidden in caves above the Dead Sea before the Roman destruction of Qumran in the year 68 after Christ, contain copies of Daniel that date to roughly 125 years before Christ. So whoever wrote Daniel, whenever they wrote it, the 69 weeks oracle was on the books at least 125 years before the events it predicts. And whatever date you assign for the writing of Daniel, the carpenter who rode the donkey down the Mount of Olives in the spring of the year 32, after Christ kept the appointment specified in the text, exactly when the text said he would. Gabriel did not stop with the cutting off of the Messiah. The oracle continued, and the continuation has been the subject of more theological argument than perhaps any other single passage in Scripture. And the people of the prince that shall come shall destroy the city and the sanctuary, and the end thereof shall be with a flood, and unto the end of the war desolations are determined. The people of a coming prince would destroy the city and the temple. The end would come with a flood, the Hebrew idiom for an overwhelming military invasion. The desolations would be terrible. This was a strange addition. Gabriel had just laid out a calendar of 70 weeks. He had described what would happen during the first 7 weeks and what would happen at the end of the next 62 weeks. The Messiah would be cut off, and then, between the cutting off of the Messiah and the 70th week, an unspecified period would intervene, during which the city and the temple would be destroyed by the army of a coming prince. The 70th week itself, the last 7 years of the 490, was being held aside. It was being separated from the first 69. There would be a gap. Daniel was not told how long the gap would be. He was simply told that the 70th week would not begin until later, when the prince to come confirmed a covenant with many for 1 week, and in the middle of that week he would cause the sacrifice and the oblation to cease. Daniel was not given the date of the 70th week. He was given only its shape. He was given only the things that would happen during it. The prince would confirm a covenant with many for 7 years. In the middle of those 7 years, 3.5 years in, he would break the covenant and cause the temple sacrifices to cease. He would set up something Daniel called the abomination that maketh desolate, a phrase Daniel had used twice elsewhere in his book, in connection with a future desecration of the temple. And then, at the end of the appointed time, judgment would be poured out on the desolator. The 70th week, in other words, would be a final period of 7 years, a future period, in which a coming prince would rise to power, make a treaty with Israel, break the treaty halfway through, desecrate the temple, and unleash the worst persecution the world had ever seen, before being himself destroyed by the return of the one who had been cut off. Daniel did not understand half of what he had been told. He says so. He writes, "I heard, but I understood not. Then said I, O my Lord, what shall be the end of these things? And the angel told him that the words were closed up and sealed till the time of the end." Daniel was being given information that was not for his generation. He was being given information for a very distant future. And he was being told that at the end of the age, when the events began to unfold, those who had eyes to see would see what Daniel had not been able to. For the moment, Daniel was simply asked to write it down. So he wrote it down. The 4 verses of the 70 weeks oracle were preserved, copied, hand-carried into Babylon and out of Babylon, into Persia and out of Persia, into the libraries of the Greek Empire, and into the synagogues of the Roman world. And across the centuries, men and women who could count began to do the arithmetic. By the 1st century after Christ, the calculation was widely known among the Jewish people. The historian Josephus mentions it. The rabbis of the period mention it. Many of the Jews of the 1st century knew, from Daniel's prophecy, that the time of the Messiah was at hand. This is one of the reasons why the Gospels speak of an air of expectation in the Judea of the 1st century. Simeon, the old man in the temple at Jerusalem, who took the infant Jesus into his arms and said, "Now lettest thou thy servant depart in peace," was waiting for the consolation of Israel. Anna, the elderly widow who served in the temple night and day, was waiting too. They were not waiting in the abstract. They were waiting because they could count, and the count said the time was near. After the resurrection of Jesus, the early Christians went back to Daniel and looked at the 70th week, the final 7 years that had been left hanging at the end of the prophecy. They saw that the gap between the 69th week and the 70th week was now visible to them. The Messiah had been cut off. The city and the temple were still standing, but the prophecy said they would be destroyed. They watched, year after year, as the political situation in Judea grew more unstable. Tensions between the Jewish population and the Roman occupiers grew sharper. Procurators came and went, most of them inept, several of them cruel, all of them adding fuel to a fire that was building. Then in the year 66, after Christ, the fire broke out. The Jewish revolt began. And 4 years later, in the year 70 after Christ, a Roman general named Titus Vespasianus, the son of the new emperor Vespasian, brought 4 legions to the gates of Jerusalem and laid siege to the city. The siege lasted from the spring through the late summer. The walls were breached. The temple courts were taken. The temple itself caught fire. Whether by accident or by design, no one could later quite agree, and the gold of its decorations melted down into the cracks between the stones. After the fire was put out, the soldiers, looking to recover the gold, prized every stone of the temple apart. Not one stone was left upon another. The temple that had stood for nearly 6 centuries since the days of Zerubbabel was reduced to a flat field of rubble. The city was thrown down. The Jews who survived were taken in chains to Rome to walk in the triumphal procession of Titus, an event still depicted on the Arch of Titus that stands in Rome to this day, with the great 7-branched candlestick of the temple visible in the relief, being carried by the prisoners of war. The people of the prince that shall come had destroyed the city and the sanctuary, exactly as Gabriel had told Daniel 6.5 centuries earlier. The end had come with a flood, an overwhelming military invasion, exactly as the angel had said. 2 of the major elements of Daniel's oracle had now been fulfilled. The Messiah had been cut off in the year 32 after Christ. The city and the temple had been destroyed in the year 70 after Christ. The gap between the 69th week and the 70th week had now stretched past the destruction of Jerusalem. What remained unfulfilled was the 70th week itself, the final 7 years. The covenant confirmed by the coming prince, the sacrifices stopped in the middle of the 7 years. The abomination that makes desolate, the unprecedented suffering, the judgment poured out on the desolator. None of those had happened in the 1st century. None of them had happened in any subsequent century either. The 70th week was being held in suspension, in a future no one could see the end of, while the people of God were scattered to the 4 winds and the city of God lay in ruins. Daniel had been told that he was being given the prophecy for the time of the end. He had been told that the words were sealed until then. He had been told that at the end of the age, the people of insight would understand. The first 69 weeks had run their course on the calendar. The Messiah had come. The Messiah had been cut off. The city and the temple had been destroyed. The 70th week was waiting. Somewhere out beyond the horizon of Daniel's vision, beyond the horizon of the first century, beyond the horizon of the Roman Empire and the medieval world and the modern world, waiting until the conditions on the ground would allow it to begin. What is most haunting about Daniel's oracle is the precision of what it gave and the silence of what it withheld. It gave the year of the Messiah's appearance, and the carpenter rode in on the donkey on schedule. It gave the manner of the Messiah's death, cut off, but not for himself, and the man on the cross outside the city walls was cut off on schedule, not for himself, exactly as the prophet had said. It gave the destruction of the city and the temple after the cutting off of the Messiah, and the legions of Titus carried out the destruction in the year 70 after Christ. 3 out of 4 major waypoints have been kept on the calendar. One waypoint remains. And the waypoint that remains is the end of the age itself, the consummation, the final week in which all of human history is gathered up into a final crisis and resolved. That is the long shadow of the 70 weeks. It begins in the spring of 445 before Christ with a Persian king signing a decree to rebuild a city. It runs through the spring of 32 after Christ with a carpenter riding into that rebuilt city on a donkey. It runs through the late summer of 70 after Christ with a Roman general burning the city to the ground. And it points forward with a finger that has not stopped pointing for nearly 2,000 years to a final 7 years that have not yet begun. The clock that started ticking in the office of a Persian secretary has been measured out in extraordinary detail, and the last 7 minutes of the count have been held in reserve. The man who received this prophecy never saw any of it fulfilled. Daniel died in Persia in his 90s, around the year 530 before Christ, more than 5 centuries before the carpenter would ride into Jerusalem on the donkey. He never saw the temple rebuilt by Zerubbabel and Ezra, though he had prayed for it. He never saw Jerusalem repopulated. He never knew that his own arithmetic, written out under angelic dictation in a Persian palace, would be one of the most studied passages in the entire Bible for the next 25 centuries. He simply wrote it down, sealed up the book as he had been told, and laid down at the end of his long, lonely life, with his window still open toward a city he had not seen since he was a teenage boy. His final recorded word from the angel was a tender one. "Go thy way, Daniel, but thou go thy way till the end be, for thou shalt rest, and stand in thy lot at the end of the days." Daniel was promised rest, and he was promised that he would rise again at the end of the days. He went to his rest in Persian soil, and he is still in that rest, waiting for the 70th week to run its course and the resurrection to find him. But while Daniel slept, the world he had been told about kept moving. The carpenter who rode the donkey through the gates was crucified, raised, and lifted out of sight 40 days later. The Jewish revolt smoldered for a generation and finally exploded. And in the years between the cutting off of the Messiah and the burning of the temple, the carpenter himself, in the last week of his earthly ministry, sat with his disciples on the slope of the Mount of Olives, looked across the Kidron Valley at the magnificent stones of the temple Herod the Great had renovated to dazzling splendor, and told them, in language so precise that they thought he was speaking of the end of the world, that the whole edifice they were looking at would be torn down stone by stone within the lifetime of some of the men sitting beside him. The Roman legions were 40 years away. The carpenter could see them coming. And what he said that afternoon on the Mount of Olives became the next of the great prophecies of Scripture, a prophecy that would be tested in fire within 1 generation of the day he spoke it. The afternoon in question was a Tuesday, in the spring of the year 32 after Christ. It was the 3rd day of what would later be called Holy Week, the second to last day Jesus would spend teaching publicly before the events of the Passion took him out of public sight and into the hands of his accusers. He had spent the morning in the temple courts, walking among the colonnades, answering the trick questions of the Pharisees and the Sadducees, telling parables that had stung the priests and the scribes so sharply that they had begun looking for a way to take him by stealth. By afternoon, he was tired, and the crowd in the temple was thinning, and he turned with his disciples and walked out through the eastern gate, down across the Kidron Valley, and up the western slope of the Mount of Olives. Halfway up, where the path levels out for a moment, he stopped and turned around. The disciples turned with him. What they were looking at, across the valley, was one of the architectural wonders of the ancient world. The temple complex of Herod the Great occupied the entire eastern flank of the city, on the platform where Solomon's first temple had once stood. Herod, who had taken the throne of Judea about 37 years before Christ, had been a paranoid and bloody man, but he had also been one of the great builders of antiquity. His engineers had doubled the size of the original temple platform by extending it on enormous arched supports out over the Kidron Valley. The retaining walls were built of limestone blocks so vast that even today, 2,000 years after their cutting, visitors stand at the foot of them and find it difficult to believe they were placed there by human hands. Some of the stones in the foundation course weighed more than 500 tons. Above the platform rose the temple itself, sheathed in white marble and gold, so brilliant in the sun that approaching travelers, the historian Josephus would later write, had to shield their eyes from the brightness. The doors of the sanctuary were plated in gold. The curtain at the entrance was woven of fine blue and purple linen, and the whole edifice was surrounded by colonnaded courts paved in marble that gleamed like ivory. The temple in this state had been under construction for nearly 50 years by the time Jesus walked out of it that afternoon. Herod had begun the renovation about 19 years before Christ, and the work was still going on. It would not be completed in its final form until around the year 63 after Christ, only 7 years before its destruction. The Jews of the first century after Christ took fierce pride in this temple. It was the center of their religious life, the dwelling place of the divine name, the focal point of the entire sacrificial system that had been ordained through Moses 1,500 years earlier. Pilgrims traveled from every corner of the Roman world to worship there, 3 times a year for the great feasts, packing the streets and the courts and the surrounding hillsides, until the city's population swelled from its ordinary 40,000 to perhaps 200,000 or more during Passover. The disciples loved the temple. They had grown up making the pilgrimage from Galilee. They had seen the smoke of the morning and evening sacrifices rising from the great altar. They had stood in the court of Israel during the singing of the Psalms. As they walked out of the temple courts that Tuesday afternoon, one of them, Mark records, turned to Jesus and said, "Master, see what manner of stones and what buildings are here." It was a tourist's remark. It was the proud comment of a young Galilean who could not quite get over how impressive Jerusalem was every time he came up for the feast. The remark was meant to elicit agreement. "Aren't they magnificent?" Jesus did not agree. He looked at the temple that had taken almost half a century to build to its current state of glory, the temple that was the center of his nation's identity, the temple where as an infant he had been presented, and where as a 12-year-old he had astonished the teachers with his questions. And he said, "Seest thou these great buildings? There shall not be left one stone upon another, that shall not be thrown down." The disciples did not say anything for a moment. The remark was so jarring that it must have stopped the conversation cold. The temple of Herod was, by every visible standard, indestructible. Its walls were too thick, its stones were too vast, its political significance was too great. The Romans, even at their most brutal, had not desecrated it. To say that not one stone of it would be left upon another was to say something so apocalyptic in its implications that the disciples could only have heard it as a metaphor or a riddle. They walked the rest of the way up the Mount of Olives in silence, or perhaps in low conversation among themselves, until they reached the level area near the top, where they could sit and look back across the valley at the city. The temple lay directly below them, the white and gold of it almost painful in the late afternoon light. The disciples sat down. 4 of them in particular, Peter, James, John, and Andrew came to Jesus privately and asked him the questions they had been turning over since he had spoken about the stones. "Tell us, when shall these things be? And what shall be the sign when all these things shall be fulfilled?" Matthew records the question in slightly fuller form. "Tell us, when shall these things be? And what shall be the sign of thy coming and of the end of the world?" The disciples, in asking the second part of their question, had collapsed two events into one. They assumed that the destruction of the temple and the end of the age must be the same event, since they could not imagine the world continuing after the fall of the temple. The temple was the center of the world for them. If it fell, the world fell. Jesus did not correct them on the framing. He answered both questions, but he wove the answers together in a way that has been the subject of careful exegesis ever since. The discourse he gave that afternoon, sitting on the Mount of Olives looking back at the doomed temple, has come down through history under the name of the Olivet Discourse, and it is recorded in 3 of the 4 Gospels, in Matthew chapter 24, in Mark chapter 13, and in Luke chapter 21. The 3 accounts overlap heavily, but each preserves details the others omit, and Luke in particular preserves a detail that becomes the key to unlocking which parts of the discourse refer to the immediate future and which parts refer to the end of the age. The discourse opens with a series of warnings about deception. Many would come in his name, claiming to be the Christ, and would deceive many. Wars and rumors of wars would be heard, but the disciples were not to be troubled, for these things must come to pass, but the end was not yet. Nation would rise against nation, and kingdom against kingdom. Famines and pestilences and earthquakes would come in various places. All these were merely the beginning of sorrows. The disciples themselves would be hated for his name's sake. They would be delivered up to councils, beaten in synagogues, brought before kings and governors. They would be betrayed by their own families. Some of them would be put to death. The gospel would be preached to all nations as a witness, and only then would the end come. For the disciples sitting beside him on the Mount of Olives, this was already information enough to absorb. They were going to be persecuted, they were going to be killed, they were going to be hated by everybody. Wars and earthquakes and famines were going to mark the period of their ministry. They needed to be ready for all of it, and not to be alarmed when it began. But then Jesus made the discourse turn, and it turned with a single sentence that rooted the next portion of his words very firmly in their immediate future. "When ye therefore shall see the abomination of desolation, spoken of by Daniel the prophet, stand in the holy place, whoso readeth, let him understand. Then let them which be in Judea flee into the mountains." The phrase abomination of desolation came directly from the book of Daniel, where it appears in the context of a coming desecration of the sanctuary. In Daniel's original usage, the phrase had pointed forward to a foreign desecration of the temple. By the time Jesus quoted it, that earlier desecration had already happened. In the 2nd century before Christ, the Greek tyrant Antiochus IV Epiphanes had marched into the temple, sacrificed a pig on the altar, set up an idol of Zeus in the holy place, and forbidden the practice of Judaism on pain of death. The Maccabean revolt that followed had cleansed the temple and rededicated it, an event still commemorated in the Jewish festival of Hanukkah. So when Jesus spoke of the abomination of desolation, his audience had 2 reference points. They knew what such a thing looked like because Antiochus had done it. And they understood that Jesus was saying it would happen again, and that when it did, the disciples in Judea were to drop everything and run. Luke's version of the discourse makes the meaning explicit by providing the historical specifics. Where Matthew and Mark say, "When ye shall see the abomination of desolation stand in the holy place," Luke records the same warning in plainer terms. "And when ye shall see Jerusalem compassed with armies, then know that the desolation thereof is nigh. Then let them which are in Judea flee to the mountains, and let them which are in the midst of it depart out. and let not them that are in the countries enter thereinto. For these be the days of vengeance, that all things which are written may be fulfilled. Luke gives the sign in concrete language. When you see armies surrounding Jerusalem, that is the sign. When that happens, run. Run from the city. Run from the surrounding villages. Do not enter the city. Get out of Judea entirely. This was a remarkable and very specific instruction. Jesus was telling his followers that when they saw the signs of an approaching siege of Jerusalem, they were not to do what every patriotic Jewish reflex would tell them to do. They were not to defend the city. They were not to take refuge inside the walls. They were not to fight for the temple. They were to flee immediately into the hills. The instruction was so urgent that it included details about how to flee. Let him which is on the housetop not come down to take anything out of his house. Neither let him which is in the field return back to take his clothes. And woe unto them that are with child, and to them that give suck in those days. But pray ye that your flight be not in the winter, neither on the Sabbath day. The flight would be sudden. There would be no time to pack. There would be no time to gather possessions. Pregnant women and nursing mothers would suffer especially because they could not move quickly. Pray that the flight does not have to happen in the rainy winter season when the roads would be impassable, and pray that it does not happen on the Sabbath when the gates of the city would be closed and travel would be religiously forbidden. For the next 38 years, the disciples and the early Christian community in Jerusalem held this warning in their memory. They watched. They waited. They knew that one day, perhaps in their lifetimes, they would see armies gathering around the city, and they knew exactly what to do when they saw it. The early church in Jerusalem grew through those decades, going from the original handful at Pentecost to thousands and then to tens of thousands. They worshiped. They shared their goods. They faced persecution from the religious authorities. They sent out missionaries to the wider Roman world. James, the brother of Jesus, became the leader of the Jerusalem church and was eventually killed for his faith around the year 62 after Christ. The persecutions Jesus had warned them about came one by one, but the great sign, the gathering of armies around the city, did not come for nearly 4 decades. Then it came. In the year 66 after Christ, the long festering tension between the Jewish population and the Roman procurators finally exploded. The procurator at the time was a man named Gaius Florus, who was so corrupt and so cruel that even his Roman superiors were embarrassed by him. He raided the temple treasury, took 17 talents of silver for himself, and provoked the population of Jerusalem into open rebellion. The crowd in Jerusalem began collecting coins in mock charity to give to the impoverished governor. Florus retaliated with a massacre. The revolt spread. The Roman garrison in Jerusalem was overrun and slaughtered. The Roman fortress of Masada was taken by Jewish rebels. The fire was lit, and it spread across the country. Rome's response came under the governor of Syria, Cestius Gallus, who marched south with the 12th Legion and a large force of auxiliaries to put down the uprising. He reached Jerusalem in the autumn of 66 after Christ, fought his way to the outer walls, and besieged the Temple Mount. He came very close to taking the city. According to Josephus, who was an eyewitness to many of these events, Gallus had begun to undermine the wall of the temple court when he abruptly, inexplicably, lifted the siege and withdrew. Why he did so has never been adequately explained. Josephus himself attributes the decision to some divine displeasure with Gallus, or to bad counsel, or to the simple poor judgment of the general. Whatever the reason, Gallus pulled his army back from Jerusalem, and the Jewish rebels, encouraged by what looked like a miraculous deliverance, fell on his retreating column at the pass of Beth Horon and turned the retreat into a rout. Thousands of Roman soldiers were killed. The eagle of the 12th Legion was lost. It was one of the worst military disasters Rome had suffered in a century. But before the disaster, while Gallus was still marching on Jerusalem, The Christian community in the city had seen exactly what Jesus had told them to look for. They had seen Jerusalem compassed with armies. They had seen the desolation of the city drawing near, and they remembered the instruction. According to the early church historian Eusebius, writing in the 4th century after Christ, but drawing on much earlier sources, the entire Christian community in Jerusalem and Judea fled the city before the siege closed in. They went, by tradition, across the Jordan to a town called Pella in the Decapolis region of what is now northern Jordan. Some of them may have gone further. The point is that they left. They abandoned their homes, their property, their inheritances, the very city that was the cradle of their faith, on the strength of a warning given 34 years earlier on the slope of the Mount of Olives. And because they left, when the catastrophe came, they were not in it. The Jewish historian Josephus, who chronicled the war from the Roman side, mentions almost no Christian deaths in the destruction of Jerusalem. They had read the warning. They had believed it. They had run. The withdrawal of Cestius Gallus gave the Jewish rebels a false confidence. They consolidated their hold on Jerusalem, set up a revolutionary government, and began to mint their own coinage with the proud inscription, Jerusalem the Holy, and the date year 1 of the liberation of Israel. They had no idea what was coming. The Emperor Nero, hearing the news of the disaster, dispatched his most experienced general to deal with the revolt. The general was Titus Flavius Vespasianus, known to history as Vespasian, an old soldier who had earned his reputation in the conquest of Britain. Vespasian arrived in the spring of 67 after Christ, with 3 full legions and a large force of auxiliaries, and he began the methodical reduction of the Jewish countryside. He took the Galilee first, then Samaria, then the coastal plain. By the year 68 after Christ, he had isolated Jerusalem from the surrounding country, and he was preparing to close in on the city itself. Then political upheaval in Rome interrupted everything. The Emperor Nero, hated and abandoned, committed suicide in the summer of 68 after Christ. The empire fell into civil war. The next 18 months saw 4 different men claim the imperial throne, the so-called Year of the 4 Emperors. Vespasian, watching from his command in Judea, eventually allowed himself to be acclaimed emperor by his own legions marched on Rome, and took the throne himself in late 69 after Christ. Before he left, he delegated the completion of the Jewish war to his eldest son Titus, who had been with him through the campaign and who now took command of the 4 legions besieging Jerusalem. Titus was about 30 years old when he took up the command. He was a capable soldier, and by the standards of Roman generals he was not particularly cruel, but he was given a job, and he intended to finish it. In the spring of 70 after Christ, just before Passover, he brought his 4 legions to the gates of Jerusalem and began the formal siege. The city was crowded with pilgrims who had come up for the feast. The population inside the walls swelled from its ordinary 40 or 50,000 to perhaps 500,000 or more. Titus closed the ring around them. What happened in Jerusalem over the next 5 months was one of the most ghastly episodes in the long history of human warfare. The city was divided internally between rival rebel factions who hated each other almost as much as they hated the Romans. The fanatical zealots had taken the Temple Mount. The followers of John of Gischala held the Antonia fortress and the upper city. The followers of Simon Bar Giora held the lower city and parts of the western quarter. Throughout the early months of the siege, these factions fought each other in the streets, even as the Roman engineers built their siege towers and ramparts outside the walls. The internal fighting destroyed the city's grain storehouses, which had been deliberately torched by one faction to deny the supply to another. And within weeks, the city was starving. Josephus, who watched the siege from the Roman side as a translator and interpreter for Titus, recorded scenes that even now are difficult to read. People stripped the bark off trees and ate it. They scoured the sewers for grains of food. They ate things no human being should ever eat. Mothers ate their children. the most appalling fulfillment of an ancient curse from the book of Deuteronomy that had been on the books for 1,500 years. Bodies piled up in the streets faster than they could be buried. The stench of death covered the city like a fog. Anyone caught trying to flee the city to the Roman lines was crucified outside the walls in full view of the defenders, and the crucifixions went on day after day, sometimes 500 a day, until the slopes of the surrounding hills were thick with crosses, and the soldiers had run out of wood to make more. The walls were breached one by one. The Antonia fortress fell first, in the summer. The outer courts of the temple were taken. The temple itself was burned down on the 9th of Av in the Hebrew calendar, the date now used to commemorate the destruction. There is some debate as to whether Titus had wanted the temple preserved or destroyed. Josephus claims Titus had wanted to save it. Other ancient sources, including the Roman historian Sulpicius Severus, who may have been drawing on the lost portion of Tacitus's histories, say that Titus deliberately ordered the destruction. Whatever the truth, the temple burned. The flames climbed the gold-plated walls. The soldiers, by Josephus's account, threw firebrands into every chamber and corner, even chambers Titus himself had wanted to spare. The molten gold from the decorations ran down between the great stones of the temple platform and pooled in the foundation crevices. After the fire had cooled, Titus gave the order that has become one of the most haunting fulfillments of any biblical prophecy ever spoken. The soldiers, looking to recover the gold, were told to dismantle the temple stone by stone. Every single block of the temple proper was prized apart from its neighbors, hoisted down from the platform, and tipped over the edge of the retaining wall into the valley below. The platform itself was left, because the platform was retaining wall, not temple. But the temple itself, the courts, the sanctuary, the holy place and the Holy of Holies, the altar of burnt offering, the chambers and porticos, every stone was pulled apart and thrown down. Not one stone was left upon another. The carpenter's words from 38 years earlier on the Mount of Olives had been kept to the letter. "Seest thou these great buildings? There shall not be left one stone upon another that shall not be thrown down." It was a literal description, by a man with no sword, given more than a generation in advance, of what a Roman general acting on imperial orders would do to the most sacred building in Judaism. The level of destruction was so total that 2,000 years later, archaeologists working on the Temple Mount have not yet recovered a single original stone of the temple proper. They have recovered enormous foundation stones from the retaining walls, the so-called Western Wall and the Southern Wall, but the temple itself is gone as if it had never been there. The destruction did not end with the temple. The upper city held out for another month, then it too was taken. The slaughter went on for days. The Roman historians and Josephus give numbers that are difficult to credit, but Josephus claims that more than 1 million people died in the siege of Jerusalem. Whatever the true figure, the casualties were staggering. The survivors were rounded up. The strongest of the men were sent to Rome to walk in the triumphal procession, then to the mines of Egypt, or to the games in the amphitheaters of the empire, where most of them died. The young women were sold as slaves. The leaders, John of Gischala and Simon Bar Giora, were taken to Rome in chains. Simon Bar Giora was ritually executed at the climax of the triumph, dragged to the Mamertine prison and strangled on the steps, in accordance with the ancient Roman custom for defeated enemy leaders. The triumph itself, celebrated in the streets of Rome in the year 71 after Christ, was one of the grandest the city had ever seen. The 7-branched candlestick of the temple, the gold table of the showbread, and the silver trumpets used by the priests were paraded through the streets and deposited in the new temple of peace that Vespasian was building. The Arch of Titus, erected in the Roman Forum a few years later, depicted the procession in stone, and the relief showing the menorah being carried by the captives is still visible there today, more than 19 centuries after it was carved. The fall of Jerusalem, in the year 70 after Christ, was one of the most thoroughly documented disasters of the ancient world. Because Josephus had been a primary participant in the war on the Jewish side before going over to the Romans, and he spent the rest of his life writing the history of what he had seen. His 7-volume work, The Jewish War, written in Greek for a Roman audience, preserves the only detailed contemporary account. Reading it is like reading a transcript of the carpenter's prophecy being fulfilled point by point. The wars and rumors of wars, the famines, the pestilences that broke out in the besieged city, the earthquakes felt in the region during those years, the persecution of the disciples, the betrayal by family members, the hating of believers for the name, the standing of the abomination in the holy place, which the Roman soldiers fulfilled in the most graphic possible way when they erected their legionary standards inside the temple courts and offered sacrifices to them in the inner sanctuary, while their dying enemies watched and the temple burned around them. Roman religious practice required the legions to sacrifice to their standards, which bore the image of the emperor and the eagle of Rome. To do so in the holy place of the Jewish temple was the abomination of desolation in the most literal sense the phrase could possibly carry. Jesus had also said in the Olivet Discourse that Jerusalem shall be trodden down of the Gentiles until the times of the Gentiles be fulfilled. The phrase trodden down is military language. It refers to a city being walked over by the boots of foreign armies, occupied, garrisoned, ruled by people who are not its own. After the fall of 70 after Christ, that is exactly what happened. The Jews were forbidden to enter the city. A second and final revolt broke out under a messianic claimant named Simon bar Kokhba in the years 132 to 135 after Christ. And when that revolt was crushed by the Emperor Hadrian, the destruction was completed. Hadrian rebuilt Jerusalem as a Roman colony, renamed it Aelia Capitolina, erected a temple to Jupiter on the ruins of the Jewish temple, plowed the city under in some accounts, and forbade Jews on pain of death from setting foot inside its boundaries. The province of Judea itself was renamed Syria Palestina, after the ancient Philistine enemies of the Jews, in a deliberate attempt to erase the Jewish identity of the land. For the next 18.5 centuries, Jerusalem would be trodden down by Gentile armies, occupied successively by the Romans, the Byzantines, the Persians under Khosrow II, the Arab caliphates, the Crusaders, the Ayyubids under Saladin, the Mamluks, the Ottomans, and finally the British. Not one of those occupations belonged to the people of the city. The temple platform was used as a refuse dump by the Christian Byzantines, then crowned with 2 Islamic shrines by the Umayyad caliphs in the late 7th century after Christ, then used as a stable and palace by the Crusaders, then reclaimed for Islamic worship by Saladin. The city changed hands. The walls were rebuilt and broken down and rebuilt again. The names of the gates changed. But never, in all that time, was the city Jewish again in the political sense until the middle of the 20th century after Christ. The fulfillment of the Olivet Discourse, in its near-term reference, was so total and so verifiable that no honest reader of history can dismiss it. The carpenter on the Mount of Olives, in the year 32, after Christ told 4 men, sitting beside him in the late afternoon sun, exactly what would happen to the temple they were looking at. He told them when to flee, what to flee from, and how to recognize the moment of flight. He told them that the destruction would be so total that not one stone would be left upon another. He told them that the city would then be trodden down by the Gentiles for an unspecified period. And every single one of those statements, made in advance by a man who would be dead within 72 hours of speaking them, came true within a single generation, with such precision that the early Christians who had heard the original prophecy and survived to see its fulfillment must have felt a kind of dazed terror at the accuracy of what they had witnessed. But the Olivet Discourse was not only about the immediate future. As the disciples had originally framed their question, They had asked about the destruction of the temple and about the end of the age, and Jesus, in his answer, had woven the two together without always making clear which sentence applied to which event. Some of what he said came true within 40 years in the siege and burning of the city. Some of it has not yet come true. He spoke of a tribulation greater than any since the world began, of false Christs and false prophets, performing signs and wonders so great that, if it were possible, they would deceive even the elect. He spoke of the sun being darkened and the moon not giving her light, of the stars falling from heaven, of the powers of the heavens being shaken. He spoke of the sign of the Son of Man appearing in heaven, of all the tribes of the earth mourning, of the Son of Man coming in the clouds with power and great glory, of the angels gathering together his elect from the four winds. None of those things happened in the year 70 after Christ. The sun did not go dark in any cosmic sense. The Son of Man did not appear in the clouds. The angels did not gather the elect. Those parts of the discourse, like the 70th week of Daniel, are still waiting. The carpenter had spoken of two events at once, and laid them on top of each other, the destruction of the temple as a near-term sign, and the end of the age as the more distant horizon for which the destruction was a kind of preview. The disciples could not yet separate the two. They thought they would see the end of the age within their own lifetimes. But the destruction of the temple came on schedule, and the end of the age did not. And the long centuries that have followed have been the centuries during which Jerusalem has been trodden down of the Gentiles, exactly as he said it would be, until a moment that he did not specify, but that he carefully indicated would arrive at last, until the times of the Gentiles be fulfilled, until, the word implies, a stop. The treading down would not be permanent. There would come a moment when the times of the Gentiles would be fulfilled, when Jerusalem would no longer be trodden down, and that moment, like the end of the age itself, was being held in the future, somewhere out beyond the horizon of the apostolic generation, somewhere out beyond the long centuries of dispersion that followed. The dispersion had already been written about. The scattering of the Jewish people across the face of the earth, the loss of their land, the centuries of wandering among nations who alternately tolerated and slaughtered them, all of it had been foretold long before the carpenter ever sat on the Mount of Olives, and so had the regathering. The promise of a return, when no return seemed possible, had been planted in the Hebrew Bible by the prophets centuries before the first dispersion, and it had been planted in the strangest possible form, the form of a vision given to a priest sitting by a foreign canal, a vision of a valley filled with skeletons, a vision in which the bones of a long-dead nation began, against every law of biology and every reasonable expectation, to rattle. The priest's name was Ezekiel, and he had been carried away from Jerusalem in the second wave of deportations, 11 years before the city itself was destroyed. The first wave had taken the young aristocrats. The second wave, in the year 597 before Christ, swept up the skilled craftsmen, the soldiers, the priests, and the people who knew how to keep a society running. Ezekiel was 25 years old when he was loaded into the line of captives and marched the long road north and east through Mesopotamia, 800 miles or more, until he was deposited in a refugee settlement on the banks of a canal called the Chebar, which ran out of the Euphrates River near the great city of Babylon. He was the son of a priest named Buzi, and he had been training all his life to serve in the temple at Jerusalem. Now he was sitting in a foreign country, beside a foreign waterway, with no temple to serve in and no realistic prospect of ever seeing one again. The Chebar Canal was one of the great irrigation systems of the Babylonian heartland. It ran for 100 miles or more across the flat alluvial plain, feeding water to the fields of barley and date palms that supplied the empire. The Jewish exiles had been settled along its banks in colonies, given houses, allowed to plant vineyards, allowed to marry and raise children. The Babylonians, unlike the Assyrians who had come before them, did not believe in scattering their conquered peoples to the four winds. They preferred to keep them concentrated, where they could be taxed and watched. So the exiles lived together. They wept together. They tried to keep the calendar of feasts, even though they had no temple in which to celebrate them. And among them, in the 5th year of the captivity, when Ezekiel was 30 years old, the heavens opened above the canal, and the visions of God began. The visions came in waves. They came over a span of years. They were so strange and so vivid that Ezekiel's writings have ever after been read with a kind of awed disorientation by anyone who picks them up. He saw wheels within wheels, full of eyes, turning in directions a wheel cannot turn. He saw 4 living creatures with 4 faces each, the face of a man and the face of a lion and the face of an ox and the face of an eagle. He saw a throne above the firmament, and a man-shaped figure on the throne, surrounded by what looked like fire and amber. He fell on his face. He was told to stand up. He was given a scroll to eat, and the scroll tasted as sweet as honey in his mouth, even though it was full of woes and lamentations and judgments. The Lord set him as a watchman to the house of Israel. That was his job. He was to warn the exiles. He was to warn the Jews still living in Jerusalem. He was to call them to repentance, even though most of them would not listen. And he was to do this work, year after year, with strange and difficult demonstrations that the Lord required of him as living illustrations of the messages he carried. He was made to lie on his left side for 390 days, then on his right side for 40 more, bearing in his own body the symbolic weight of the years of Israel's iniquity. He was made to shave his head and his beard, and divide the hair into 3 portions, burning one, striking one with a sword, and scattering one to the wind, as a picture of the fates that awaited the people of Jerusalem. The hardest of his demonstrations came when his wife died. The Lord told him in the morning that the desire of his eyes would be taken from him with a stroke that very evening, and that he was forbidden to mourn her publicly. He was not to weep. He was not to put on sackcloth. He was not to bare his head in the customary gesture of grief. His silence was to be a sign to the people, a sign of how the people would not be able to mourn for the destruction of Jerusalem when it came, because their grief would be too great for the ordinary forms of mourning to contain. So Ezekiel did the unthinkable. He buried his wife. He did not weep where anyone could see him. He went on with his prophetic work the next morning, as if nothing had happened. And the people, when they asked him what his strange behavior meant, were given the answer he had been told to give. Thus saith the Lord God, I will profane my sanctuary, the excellency of your strength, the desire of your eyes. The temple in Jerusalem, which the people loved as Ezekiel had loved his wife, would be taken from them, and they too would be unable to mourn it the way it deserved. For most of his early ministry, Ezekiel's messages were messages of judgment. He warned of the coming destruction of Jerusalem. He described, in vision, the glory of God leaving the temple, lifting itself off the cherubim above the ark, moving to the threshold of the house, and finally rising up out of the city altogether and standing on the Mount of Olives east of the city before disappearing. Without that glory, the temple was just a building. Without that glory, the city was just a city. The departure of the divine presence was the real catastrophe. The Babylonian armies that arrived in the year 587 before Christ were merely the secondary cause. When Jerusalem fell, when the news finally reached the exile communities along the Chebar, the tone of Ezekiel's prophecies began to change. The judgment had come. The thing he had been warning about for a decade had now happened. From this point onward, the burden of his oracles shifted. He began to speak less of judgment and more of restoration, less of the ruin to come and more of what God would do when the ruin had run its course, less of the rending and more of the healing. The prophets who walked through the destruction of Jerusalem with their people, men like Jeremiah and Ezekiel, are remembered now for the harshness of their warnings. But the longer half of their preaching, the half that came after the catastrophe, was about the impossible promise of a future restoration. It was in this later phase of his ministry that Ezekiel was given the vision that has burned in the imagination of his readers for the next 25 centuries. "The hand of the Lord," he writes, "was upon him. He was carried out in the Spirit and set down in the middle of a valley. The valley was full of bones. He was led around them, and they were many, very many, and they were very dry." Read those words again. Very many and very dry. Bones that have been dead long enough to lose every trace of moisture. Bones that have lain on the ground for so long that the wind and the sun have bleached them. Bones that no one has bothered to bury. Bones scattered as if a great battle had been fought there long ago, and the winners had simply walked off and left the field to the carrion birds. The Lord asked Ezekiel a question. "Son of man, can these bones live?" It was a question with only one possible honest answer. Ezekiel knew anatomy. He was a priest. He had handled bodies in the rituals of his trade. He knew what dry bones meant. They meant that the soul had departed long ago, that the muscle and the sinew and the skin had rotted away, that even the marrow had withered. Bones in this state did not live again. They could not live again. They were the very picture of the irreversibility of death. And yet Ezekiel, when asked the question, gave the only answer a faithful man could give. He said, "O Lord God, thou knowest." Not yes, not no. He passed the question back to the only one who could possibly answer it. The Lord told him to prophesy to the bones. "Prophesy upon these bones, and say unto them, O ye dry bones, hear the word of the Lord." Notice the strangeness of the command. Bones cannot hear. Bones have no ears. Bones have no nervous system. Bones have nothing through which a message could possibly enter and be processed. And yet the prophet was being commanded to speak to them as if they could hear, as if the word of the Lord could penetrate even into a place where every biological capacity for receiving it had long since dissolved. He was being commanded to speak as if a word from God could call life out of a place where life had no foothold left. So Ezekiel prophesied. He spoke the word he was given. "Behold, I will cause breath to enter into you, and ye shall live. And I will lay sinews upon you, and will bring up flesh upon you, and cover you with skin, and put breath in you, and ye shall live. And ye shall know that I am the Lord." The promise was given in stages: sinews, then flesh, then skin, then breath. The reconstruction would be done in the order in which a body is built up from the inside out. And as Ezekiel spoke, he heard a noise. He heard a rattling. The bones, scattered across the floor of the valley, began to move. They began to find each other across the dust. A femur shifted toward a hip socket. A vertebra rolled toward another vertebra. A skull turned itself upright. The noise of it must have been extraordinary, the dry clattering of thousands of skeletons reassembling themselves out of the wreckage in which they had lain. Then the sinews appeared on them, the white tendons stretching across the joints, holding the bones in place. Then the flesh came up over the sinews, the muscles thickening on the bare frames, the silhouette of human bodies emerging where there had been only the white scaffolding of skeletons. Then the skin came over the flesh, sealing it, smoothing the contours, giving the assembled bodies the form and shape of living men. The valley, which had been full of dry bones, was now full of bodies. But the bodies were not yet alive. There was no breath in them. They were complete. They were anatomically perfect. And they lay there on the ground like a multitude of corpses, fully formed but not yet animated, waiting for the final element that would turn them from carcasses into men. The Lord told Ezekiel to prophesy a second time. This time he was to prophesy not to the bones, but to the wind. "Prophesy unto the wind. Prophesy, Son of man, and say to the wind, Thus saith the Lord God, Come from the four winds, O breath, and breathe upon these slain, that they may live." The Hebrew word, translated wind and breath in this passage, is the same word, ruach, which can also be translated spirit. the same word that hovered over the face of the deep on the first day of creation, the same word that was breathed into the nostrils of the man God had formed from the dust of the ground. Ezekiel was being told to summon the very breath of the Spirit of God from the four corners of the earth and to breathe it back into the assembled bodies. He prophesied. The wind came. The bodies stood up on their feet, an exceeding great army. And he said unto me, Son of man, these bones are the whole house of Israel. Behold, they say, Our bones are dried, and our hope is lost. We are cut off for our parts. Therefore prophesy and say unto them, Thus saith the Lord God, Behold, O my people, I will open your graves, and cause you to come up out of your graves, and bring you into the land of Israel. And ye shall know that I am the Lord, when I have opened your graves, O my people, and brought you up out of your graves, and shall put my spirit in you, and ye shall live, and I shall place you in your own land. Then shall ye know that I, the Lord, have spoken it, and performed it, saith the Lord God. The interpretation was given to the prophet directly. The bones were the whole house of Israel. The valley was the place of their dispersion, the long graveyard of exile, the place where they had said to themselves, Our bones are dried, and our hope is lost. We are cut off for our parts. The vision was a promise. The bones would come together. The flesh would return. The breath would enter. The nation would live again, and it would live again on its own land. The Lord would not be content to bring his people back to life in some abstract, spiritual sense, in some metaphorical resurrection of religious feeling. The promise was geographical. I shall place you in your own land. The valley of dry bones would empty out, and the land of Israel would fill up. For the first generation of exiles who heard Ezekiel speak this prophecy, it had an obvious near-term reference. They had been carried away to Babylon. They had been told they would not see Jerusalem again. They had said exactly what the bones in the vision said. Their hope had been cut off. And in the year 538 before Christ, when the Persian king Cyrus the Great conquered Babylon and issued his famous decree allowing the captive peoples to return to their homelands, the first wave of return began. About 50,000 Jews under Zerubbabel made the long journey back, rebuilt the temple in a more modest form, and reestablished a small Jewish presence in Jerusalem and the surrounding country. A second wave returned later under Ezra. A third wave came under Nehemiah, who rebuilt the walls of the city. By the 3rd century before Christ, a fragile Jewish community had been reestablished in the land. The first half of the dry bones vision had, in some sense, come true, but only in some sense. The return under Cyrus was partial, not total. The majority of the Jews stayed in Babylon, where they had built lives and businesses across the 70 years of their captivity. The kingdom of David was not restored. The independence of Israel was not regained. The land remained under Persian rule, then under Greek rule, then under Roman rule. The Jews lived in their land but did not own it. The bones had reassembled, but the breath had not fully come, and the land was not in any meaningful sense their own. Then, in the long arc of history that followed, the dispersion got worse, not better. The Roman destruction of Jerusalem in the year 70 after Christ, the second revolt under Bar Kokhba in 135 after Christ, and the systematic depopulation of Judea by the Emperor Hadrian, drove the Jews out of their land, in numbers and in completeness that the Babylonian exile had never approached. They scattered across the entire Roman world. They settled in Egypt, in North Africa, in Spain, in Gaul, in Greece, in Asia Minor, in the cities of Italy. They moved north into the German lands and east into the Slavic territories. They formed communities in places no Hebrew prophet had ever named. They lived as guests, sometimes welcomed, more often barely tolerated, occasionally expelled, periodically slaughtered, in countries that were not their own and that, for nearly 2,000 years, would never become their own. The catalogue of their sufferings during the long dispersion runs longer than any single book can hold. They were expelled from England by King Edward I in 1290. They were expelled from France in 1394. They were expelled from Spain by Ferdinand and Isabella in 1492, on the very day that Columbus sailed for the New World. They were expelled from Portugal in 1497. They were ghettoed in the cities of Italy, locked behind walls at night, marked by yellow badges or distinctive hats. They were slaughtered by the Crusaders in the Rhineland in the years of the First Crusade. They were burned alive during the Black Death of the 14th century, accused of poisoning the wells. They were massacred in the Cossack uprisings of the 17th century in what is now Ukraine. They were corralled into the Pale of Settlement by the Russian czars, then ridden down by mounted Cossacks during the great pogroms of the late 19th century. They were killed in their thousands in places with names that have lost most of their meaning to anyone outside Jewish memory: Kishinev, Bialystok, Odessa, Kiev. And then, in the middle of the 20th century after Christ, the dispersion entered its darkest phase. Beginning in the 1930s, the National Socialist government of Germany under Adolf Hitler began the systematic legal exclusion of Jews from German society. The exclusion grew. By 1938, it had become physical violence. The night of November 9th and 10th in 1938, called Kristallnacht, the Night of Broken Glass, saw synagogues burned, shops looted, and tens of thousands of Jewish men dragged off to concentration camps. By 1941, with the German conquest of Poland and the invasion of the Soviet Union, the policy had become systematic mass murder. The death camps at Auschwitz, Treblinka, Sobibor, Belzec, Chelmno, and Majdanek were built in occupied Poland. The trains ran for nearly 4 years. By the time the camps were liberated in the spring of 1945, 6 million Jews had been murdered. 1 out of every 3 Jews alive in the world at the start of the war was dead by the end of it. It was in the aftermath of this horror, with the survivors emerging from the camps and from the hiding places where they had spent the war, that the second half of Ezekiel's vision began to come true in a way no one in the centuries between had thought possible. The Jews, scattered for nearly 2,000 years across the face of the earth, began to come home. They came in trickles at first, then in streams, then in floods. The movement had actually begun decades before the catastrophe. In the late 19th century, a Jewish journalist from Hungary named Theodor Herzl had attended the trial of a French Jewish army officer named Alfred Dreyfus, falsely accused of treason, and had watched the crowds of Paris shouting death to the Jews in the streets of one of the most cultured cities in Europe. Herzl concluded that the Jews would never be safe in any of the countries where they lived. They needed a country of their own. He wrote a book called Der Judenstaat, the Jewish State, in 1896, and he convened the first Zionist Congress in Basel, Switzerland, in 1897. He died young in 1904, at the age of 44, without seeing any concrete result of his work. But the movement he had founded did not die with him. It grew. The early Zionists began buying land in Ottoman Palestine. They drained swamps that had been pestilential for centuries. They planted forests on hillsides that had been bare since the Romans had stripped them. They built villages, then towns, then cities. They learned to defend themselves. By the end of the First World War, when the Ottoman Empire collapsed and the British took over the administration of Palestine under a League of Nations mandate, the Jewish population in the land had grown to about 80,000. The British Foreign Secretary, Arthur Balfour, had issued a public letter in 1917 declaring that His Majesty's government view would favor the establishment in Palestine of a national home for the Jewish people, and the Jews of the world took this as the legal foundation for everything that followed. The years between the world wars were complicated. The British, caught between the increasing demands of the Jewish settlers and the increasing resistance of the Arab population already living in the land, kept changing their policy. They issued white papers. They limited Jewish immigration. They forbade Jewish immigration almost entirely during the years when the Jews of Europe most desperately needed to escape. Boats full of Jewish refugees were turned away from the coast of Palestine and sent back to Europe, where most of the passengers were eventually killed in the camps. But the population in the land kept growing, against every obstacle, and after the war the international tide finally turned. On the 29th of November in 1947, the United Nations General Assembly voted on a partition plan that would divide the British Mandate of Palestine into a Jewish state and an Arab state. The vote required a 2/3 majority. It got it, just barely. 33 nations voted in favor, 13 voted against, 10 abstained. The resolution passed. The Jews of the world, listening on radios scattered across every continent, heard the count and wept. Survivors of the camps, still living in displaced persons centers in Germany and Austria, danced in the streets. The decision did not give them everything they had asked for. The borders were tortured. The Jewish state was a strange shape, 3 small pieces connected by narrow corridors, with Jerusalem itself excluded and placed under international administration. But it was a state. After almost 2,000 years, the Jews were going to have a country again. The Arab states surrounding the territory rejected the partition plan and announced that they would invade the moment the British withdrew. The British, exhausted by the mandate, set the date of their withdrawal for the 14th of May in 1948. And they made it clear that they would not be staying to keep the peace afterward. As the date approached, the leaders of the Jewish community in Palestine met in a museum building in Tel Aviv and prepared the proclamation of statehood. The text was drafted in a hurry. Several names for the new state were considered, including Judea, Zion, and Israel. Israel won by a single vote. On the afternoon of Friday, the 14th of May in 1948, in a small art museum on Rothschild Boulevard in Tel Aviv, with the windows blacked out for fear of Egyptian air attack, David Ben-Gurion stood beneath a portrait of Theodore Herzl and read the declaration of the establishment of the State of Israel. The land of Israel was the birthplace of the Jewish people. Here, their spiritual, religious, and political identity was shaped. Here they first attained to statehood, created cultural values of national and universal significance, and gave to the world the eternal book of books. He read for 16 minutes. The new state was declared. The flag of Israel, the blue star of David on a white field, was raised. The orchestra played Hatikva, the Hope, which had been composed in the late 19th century as a Zionist anthem, and which now became the national anthem of a state that had not existed 24 hours earlier. The 2,000-year wait was over. Within hours of the proclamation, 5 Arab armies invaded: Egypt from the south, Jordan from the east, Syria from the northeast, Lebanon from the north. Iraq sent forces through Jordan. The newly born state was attacked on every front by enemies, who outnumbered it many times over, and who had openly announced that their goal was to drive the Jews into the sea. The fighting that followed went on for 10 months. Israel lost more than 6,000 of its people, almost 1% of its entire population, in the war for its existence. But it survived. By the time the armistice agreements were signed in 1949, Israel held more land than it had been allotted in the partition plan. The new state had not only been born, it had fought for its life and won. The dry bones had stood up on their feet, an exceeding great army, exactly as Ezekiel had seen them do in the vision by the canal 25 centuries earlier. The valley had emptied. The bones had assembled. The sinews and the flesh had returned. The breath had come from the 4 winds. And the people, scattered across continents for 2,000 years, were back on the land. The Hebrew language, which had been a dead language used only in liturgical study for nearly 2 millennia, was revived as the spoken language of the new state, the only documented case in human history of a dead language, being brought back to full living use as a national tongue. The cities the Romans had thrown down were rebuilt. The hillsides, the crusaders, and the Ottomans had stripped were reforested. The desert the prophet Isaiah had described as blossoming as the rose did, in fact, blossom. Crops grew where nothing had grown for centuries. What is most striking about this fulfillment is that it happened on a timetable no human being had set. The Jews of the 19th century had begun to prepare for it because of what they had read in the prophets, but the Jews of every preceding century had read the same prophets and seen no path to fulfillment. The political conditions for the rebirth of Israel did not exist before the 20th century. The Ottoman Empire had to fall. The British Mandate had to be created. The horror of the Holocaust had to galvanize the world's conscience. The United Nations had to come into existence as an institution capable of voting a state into being. And the survivors of the camps had to be alive, still strong enough to fight, still gathered in displaced persons' centers, rather than scattered back to the countries that had murdered their families. Every one of these factors had to converge in the same narrow window of time. They did. And on the precise day the British Mandate ended, the new state was declared, and the flag went up, and the prophecy of the dry bones, which had been preserved in the scrolls of Ezekiel for 25 centuries, found its great climactic fulfillment. The fulfillment was not, in every sense, complete. Ezekiel's vision spoke of the Spirit being put within the people, of a new heart being given to them, of God Himself dwelling in their midst. The political restoration of the nation in 1948 was not the spiritual restoration of the people. The state that was born that day was largely secular in its founding character, and many of its citizens were and remain unconvinced that the events they have lived through have any religious meaning at all. The prophet's vision included more than the gathering of the bones. It included the breath of the Spirit, in a sense that has not yet been fully poured out. The skeleton has come together. The body has been formed. The breath has begun to enter. But the vision is not yet complete. The same prophet, in the chapter immediately following the one that contains the dry bones, goes on to describe a final great war that will come against the restored nation in the latter days, a war led by a coalition of nations from the far north and from the south and from the east, a war that the Lord Himself will intervene to end. That war has not yet been fought. The vision is in motion. The bones are standing on their feet. But the army has not yet seen its last battle, and the breath has not yet fully come. 6 other minor prophets, and the major prophet Jeremiah, and the major prophet Isaiah himself, all wrote of this regathering as well. Jeremiah said that the Lord would gather His people from all the nations whither He had driven them. Isaiah said that the Lord would assemble the outcasts of Israel and gather together the dispersed of Judah from the 4 corners of the earth. Amos said that the Lord would bring again the captivity of His people Israel, and they would build the waste cities and inhabit them, and they would plant vineyards and drink the wine thereof, and they would make gardens and eat the fruit of them, and the Lord would plant them upon their land, and they would no more be pulled up out of their land which He had given them. No more be pulled up, permanent, final, the last regathering, the end of the long dispersion. The Jews of the world, looking at the events of the 20th century, saw a pattern in them that had been written out in the prophets centuries before, and that no human being could possibly have engineered into existence on schedule. The state of Israel, in the year 1948, had not been the work of any one statesman. It had been the convergence of 2,000 years of dispersion, of waiting, of remembered prayers said 3 times a day in every Jewish home in every country of the world, the prayer that always ended with the same word, next year in Jerusalem. The prayer had been said in Babylon, in Rome, in Spain, in Poland, in the camps. The prayer had been said by men and women who had no realistic expectation of ever being answered. And then the prayer had been answered on a date written on every history book and every newspaper, the 14th of May in 1948, exactly as the prophet had said it would be answered. With the breath coming from the 4 winds and the bones standing up and the army assembling on the land that had been promised to them 4,000 years earlier in a tent outside Beersheba. The aged prophet sitting beside the canal of Chebar in the 6th century before Christ had not lived to see any of this. He died in Babylon, almost certainly in his 50s or 60s, never having returned to the land. He died with his vision still pointing forward, still rolling toward a future he could not see in detail, still describing things that would not begin to be fulfilled in his own lifetime, and would not be completed even by the time Israel was reborn in the 20th century after Christ. The vision is still rolling. The bones are still standing on their feet. The breath is still entering them. And the long dispersion of the Jewish people, which had endured almost 2,000 years, has ended in the lifetime of people now living in such a way that the children of the 21st century have grown up in a world where the Jews have a country, even though their grandparents grew up in a world where the Jews did not, and even their grandparents, and the long line of ancestors stretching back to the day Titus burned the temple, grew up in a world where the Jews had no country and could not realistically expect to have one again. The vision in the valley has produced its army, but the army stands on the land in a world that is itself not yet at peace. The carpenter who told the disciples that Jerusalem would be trodden down of the Gentiles also said it would be trodden down only until the times of the Gentiles be fulfilled. The implication of the word until is that the treading down has an end, and after the end, something else begins. The bones are standing. But the prophets did not stop with the regathering. They went on. They wrote of a final week of trouble, of a final coming of the Son of Man on the clouds, of a new heaven and a new earth. And the last great prophecy of Scripture, the longest single prophetic vision ever given to a human being, was given not to Ezekiel by his canal, nor to Daniel in his palace, nor to Isaiah in his temple, but to an old man in chains on a small rocky island in the Aegean Sea, an old man who had watched the bones begin their assembly 2,000 years before they completed it, an old man whose visions would become the closing book of the entire biblical canon. The island was called Patmos. It still bears the name. It is a small, dry, mountainous lump of volcanic rock in the eastern Aegean, about 30 miles off the coast of what is now western Turkey. 6 miles long, 10 miles wide at its widest, riddled with caves and stony hills, with a few sheltered coves and almost no fresh water beyond what the rare rains brought down. The Romans used it as a place of exile for political prisoners and other troublemakers. They did not wish to execute outright, but did not wish to keep close to home either. To send a man to Patmos was to make him disappear. The journey there was a slow voyage by merchant ship across open water, with no guarantee of return. The exiles who arrived there were given enough food to live on, in some accounts a small allowance of grain and oil, and were left to scratch out their existence among the goatherds and fishermen who made up the permanent local population. The old man who arrived on the island sometime in the mid-90s of the 1st century after Christ had been one of the youngest of the original 12 disciples. He had been a Galilean fisherman in the years before he had met the carpenter from Nazareth. He and his elder brother James had worked their father's fishing boats out of the village of Bethsaida on the northern shore of the Sea of Galilee. They had been called away from those nets one morning by a young rabbi walking along the shore, and they had simply followed him, leaving their father Zebedee with the hired servants. The young rabbi had given the two brothers a nickname. He called them the Sons of Thunder, Boanerges in the original Aramaic, on account of their tempers and their tendency to want to call down fire from heaven on towns that displeased them. But the younger brother, John, had also become, in the years that followed, the disciple Jesus loved most. It was John who had leaned against him at the Last Supper. It was John who had stood at the foot of the cross, with the mother of Jesus when all the other disciples had fled, and to whom Jesus had given his mother as a charge in the last minutes of his life. Behold thy mother, behold thy son. It was John who had outrun Peter to the empty tomb on the third morning. It was John who, when the risen Christ appeared to a group of fishermen on the shore of the lake at sunrise, had been the first to recognize him and say, "It is the Lord." Of all the original 12, John lived the longest. The others had died one by one across the decades after Pentecost. James, the brother of John, had been beheaded by Herod Agrippa around the year 44 after Christ, the first of the apostles to be martyred. Peter had been crucified upside down in Rome under the Emperor Nero around 64 or 65 after Christ, in the persecutions that followed the Great Fire of Rome. James, the son of Alphaeus, had been killed in Egypt, according to one tradition, in Persia, according to another. Andrew had been crucified in Greece on a cross, set in the shape of an X, the form that still bears his name as the Psalter of St. Andrew. Thomas had carried the gospel to India and was speared to death there. Bartholomew had been flayed alive in Armenia. Matthew had been killed in Ethiopia or Persia, depending on which old account one believes. Philip had been crucified in Phrygia. Simon the Zealot, Jude, the obscure deaths of the obscure men, all of them gone before John was an old man. By the time John reached his 80s, he was the last of the 12 still walking the earth. He had served for many years as the bishop of the church at Ephesus, on the western coast of Asia Minor, in what is now Turkey. Ephesus was one of the great cities of the Roman world, a port and a center of trade, the home of the magnificent temple of Artemis, one of the 7 wonders of the ancient world. The Christian community there had grown out of the missionary work of the Apostle Paul a generation earlier, and after Paul's death, John had taken up the leadership of the church in the region. Ephesus was where John wrote his gospel, the 4th and last of the 4 canonical gospels, the one that opens with the great hymn-like prologue, "In the beginning was the Word, and the Word was with God, and the Word was God." He wrote 3 short letters as well, the epistles that bear his name in the New Testament. By the time he was in his 80s, he was the last living link to the original ministry of Jesus, the only man left on earth who had personally heard the Sermon on the Mount, who had personally watched the loaves and fishes multiply, who had personally seen the risen Christ on the morning of the resurrection. The communities scattered across the empire, who heard him preach, treated his very presence as a kind of relic. He had touched, he had seen, he had handled. He could speak in the first person about things that everyone else could speak about, only in the second or third. The Roman emperor of the period was Domitian, who took the throne in 81 after Christ and held it for 15 years until his assassination in 96. Domitian was a paranoid and increasingly tyrannical ruler whose enthusiasm for his own divinity grew across the years of his reign. He had himself addressed in official correspondence as Dominus et Deus, Lord and God, and he expected the title to be used. The Christians refused. They could call no man Lord and God except the one they worshipped, and that one was not a Roman emperor sitting on a throne by the Tiber, but a crucified Galilean carpenter raised from the dead. The refusal cost them. Domitian's persecution of the Christians was less systematic than Nero's had been a generation earlier, but it was bitter and it reached high. Even members of the imperial family were executed on charges connected to their leaning toward Christianity. Many lesser figures were sent to the mines, to the arena, or if they were considered too prominent or too sympathetic to dispose of openly, to remote islands of exile. John was sent to Patmos. The early church historian Tertullian, writing about a century later, recorded a tradition that John had first been brought to Rome and dropped into a cauldron of boiling oil from which he had emerged unharmed, and only after that supposed miracle had failed to kill him was he sentenced to exile. The historicity of the boiling oil incident is uncertain, but the exile to Patmos is firmly attested. The opening lines of the book of Revelation say so plainly. "I, John, who also am your brother, and companion in tribulation, and in the kingdom and patience of Jesus Christ, was in the isle that is called Patmos, for the word of God, and for the testimony of Jesus Christ." He had been put on that rock for the same reason the prophets of an earlier age had been killed in Jerusalem and Babylon and Egypt, because the message they carried was a message the powers of their day did not want spoken. He was probably about 90 years old when he arrived on the island. The exact age is not preserved, but the chronology fits. If he had been a teenager when the carpenter called him from his father's boats around the year 28 or 29 after Christ, he would have been in his middle 80s by the time of Domitian's persecution in the early 90s. He was an old man. His knees and his back must have been in the condition that old men's knees and backs are in. The journey across the Aegean must have been a hard one for him. The island, when he arrived, must have looked to his eyes like the end of the world, and in a sense it was. He had been sent there to die. The empire wanted him out of circulation, away from his congregation, isolated where his teaching could not infect anybody else. He was supposed to fade away on that rock and be forgotten. What happened instead has shaped human imagination for nearly 20 centuries. On the Lord's Day, the first day of the week, the day Christians observed in commemoration of the resurrection, John was alone, somewhere on the island, perhaps in the cave on the hillside, that has been pointed out to pilgrims for centuries as the site of his vision. He was praying or worshiping or simply sitting in the kind of stillness that only old men in exile know, and he heard behind him a great voice, like the sound of a trumpet. He turned. He saw the source. What he saw was the same Galilean carpenter he had known 60 years earlier, but transfigured beyond recognition. One like unto the Son of Man, clothed with a garment down to the foot, and girt about the paps with a golden girdle. His head and his hairs were white like wool, as white as snow, and his eyes were as a flame of fire, and his feet like unto fine brass, as if they burned in a furnace, and his voice as the sound of many waters. And he had in his right hand 7 stars, and out of his mouth went a sharp 2-edged sword, and his countenance was as the sun shineth in his strength. John, who had once leaned his head on the breast of this same man at the Last Supper, who had once seen him weep for the death of his friend Lazarus, who had once watched him cook breakfast on a beach in Galilee, fell at his feet as one dead. He could not stand. The familiarity of the man and the unfamiliarity of his glory could not be reconciled in a human nervous system that was already old and tired. The figure laid his right hand on him and said the same words John had heard him say many times before, on a mountain at the Transfiguration, in a boat in a storm, on the morning of the resurrection. Fear not. I am the first and the last. I am he that liveth and was dead, and behold, I am alive for evermore. What followed was a series of visions that ran for what must have been hours, perhaps over the course of several days, in which John was shown things that no human being had ever seen, and that he was now charged to write down. Write the things which thou hast seen, and the things which are, and the things which shall be hereafter. The Greek word he was given for what he was experiencing was apocalypsis, which means unveiling, uncovering. The book has come to be known by that name, the Apocalypse of John, or in its English title, the Revelation. The English title is in the singular. There is only one revelation. The book is not the Revelations, plural, despite the way it is often misnamed. It is a single unified unveiling, given to a single old man on a single island, across what may have been a single extraordinary period of contemplation. The first part of the unveiling was a series of letters dictated to him for delivery to the 7 churches of Asia Minor, the churches he had been pastoring before his exile: Ephesus, Smyrna, Pergamos, Thyatira, Sardis, Philadelphia, and Laodicea. Each church was addressed by name. Each was given a specific commendation for what it had got right, and a specific rebuke for what it had got wrong. The letters are personal. They are pastoral. They name false teachers by name. They identify particular sins that particular congregations were tolerating. They promise specific rewards to those who would overcome the temptations they were facing. The letters are the only part of the book that can be dated with any confidence to the immediate first-century context. The rest of the book reaches forward into a future John could not date, and into a sequence of events that the centuries since have only partly fit into the picture. After the letters, the unveiling shifted. John saw a door opened in heaven, and a voice told him to come up. He went up in the Spirit. He found himself standing in a throne room. And immediately I was in the Spirit. And behold, a throne was set in heaven, and one sat on the throne. And he that sat was to look upon like a jasper and a sardine stone. And there was a rainbow round about the throne, in sight like unto an emerald. 24 lesser thrones surrounded the great throne, and on them sat 24 elders dressed in white. Lightning came out of the throne. Thunderings rolled from it. 7 lamps of fire burned before it. A sea of glass spread out before it. 4 living creatures, similar to but not identical with the ones Ezekiel had seen by his canal 6 centuries earlier, surrounded the throne and never ceased their cries of, "Holy, holy, holy, Lord God Almighty, which was and is to come." John was watching the worship of heaven, the eternal liturgy that had been going on long before he was born and would continue long after he was dead. The book he had once helped his congregation to compose, the songs of praise sung in Christian assemblies in Ephesus and Smyrna, were echoes of this. The original was here. The throne room he was standing in was the place where every act of worship that had ever risen from the surface of the earth had been received, and where every hymn ever sung in every house, church of the persecuted communities of the empire had been heard. In the right hand of the one on the throne, John saw a scroll. The scroll was sealed with 7 seals. A mighty angel proclaimed with a loud voice, "Who is worthy to open the book and to loose the seals thereof?" No one in heaven, no one on earth, no one under the earth was found worthy to open the scroll or even to look upon it. John, watching, began to weep. The grief of the moment broke something in him. The scroll contained the future. It contained the unfolding of the entire purpose of God for the consummation of all things, and there was no one worthy to read it. The accumulated weight of human failure stretched back through every generation, and there was, in heaven or on earth, no man capable of breaking those seals. One of the elders touched John on the shoulder. "Weep not. Behold, the Lion of the tribe of Judah, the Root of David, hath prevailed to open the book and to loose the 7 seals thereof." John looked up. He expected to see a lion. What he saw instead was a lamb that had been slain, with the marks of its slaughter still visible on its body, but standing alive in the center of the throne room. The lion and the lamb were the same person. The carpenter, who had been crucified outside the walls of Jerusalem in the year 32 after Christ had triumphed by being slaughtered, and the triumph of his slaughter was what gave him the right to open the scroll. The Lamb took the scroll. The 4 living creatures and the 24 elders fell down before him. They held golden bowls full of incense, which were the prayers of the saints. Every prayer that had ever been offered up to God by the suffering church across the centuries was being held in those golden bowls, accumulated, preserved, ready to be poured out at the appointed time. The choirs of heaven began to sing a new song. "Thou art worthy to take the book, and to open the seals thereof. For thou wast slain, and hast redeemed us to God by thy blood out of every kindred, and tongue, and people, and nation, and hast made us unto our God kings and priests, and we shall reign on the earth." The voices multiplied. 10,000 times 10,000, and thousands of angelic voices joined the song. Then every creature in heaven and on earth and under the earth and in the sea joined as well, until the universe was singing. And then the Lamb began to open the seals, one by one. With each opened seal, a wave of judgment broke upon the earth. The first seal was opened. A white horse appeared. The rider had a bow, and a crown was given to him, and he went forth conquering and to conquer. the horseman of conquest. He has been the subject of more theological speculation than perhaps any other figure in the book, because his appearance is at first ambiguous. He carries a bow but no arrows. He wears a crown, but his crown is not the crown of a true king, the diadema, but the crown of a victor in games, the Stephanos. He looks like Christ at first glance, riding the white horse Christ would ride later in the book, but he is not Christ. He is a counterfeit, a false savior riding out at the beginning of the end, deceiving the world with a promise of peace that will not hold. The second seal was opened. A red horse came out, and the rider was given a great sword, and power was given to him to take peace from the earth, and that they should kill one another, the horsemen of war. The bloody outbreak that follows the false peace, when the deceptions of the first horseman collapse and the nations begin to slaughter each other openly. The third seal was opened. A black horse came out, and the rider held a pair of balances in his hand. And I heard a voice in the midst of the four beasts say, "A measure of wheat for a penny, and 3 measures of barley for a penny, and see thou hurt not the oil and the wine, the horsemen of famine." A measure of wheat for a penny was approximately a single day's ration of grain for a single person, sold at the price of a full day's wages. The bread of life had been priced beyond the reach of the working man. The luxury items, the oil and the wine, were untouched, because the rich would still have their luxuries while the poor could not buy bread. The fourth seal was opened. A pale horse came out, and the rider's name was Death, and hell followed with him. Power was given to them over a fourth part of the earth, to kill with sword, and with hunger, and with death, and with the beasts of the earth, the horsemen of death. A quarter of the world's population swept away in a single act of judgment by the combined effects of the previous 3 horsemen and by other horrors not specified. The fifth seal was opened. John saw under the altar the souls of those who had been slain for the word of God and for their testimony. They cried with a loud voice, "How long, O Lord, holy and true, dost thou not judge and avenge our blood on them that dwell on the earth?" These were the martyrs, the ones who had been killed across the centuries for refusing to deny their faith. They were given white robes. They were told to rest yet for a little season, until their fellow servants and their brethren that should be killed as they were should be fulfilled. The implication was hard. More martyrs were yet to come. The full quota was not yet filled. The sixth seal was opened. The cosmic order itself began to come apart. There was a great earthquake. The sun became black as sackcloth of hair. The moon became as blood. The stars fell from heaven. The heaven departed as a scroll when it is rolled together. Every mountain and island was moved out of their places. The kings of the earth, and the great men, and the rich men, and the chief captains, and the mighty men, every bondman and every free man hid themselves in the dens and in the rocks of the mountains, crying out for the rocks to fall on them and hide them from the face of the one on the throne and from the wrath of the Lamb. For the great day of his wrath is come, and who shall be able to stand? Between the 6th and the 7th seals, John saw an interlude. He saw 4 angels standing on the 4 corners of the earth, holding back the 4 winds. He saw another angel ascending from the east, with the seal of the living God, and that angel cried with a loud voice to the 4 angels, "Hurt not the earth, neither the sea nor the trees, till we have sealed the servants of our God in their foreheads." John heard the number of those that were sealed, 144,000 of all the tribes of the children of Israel, 12,000 from each tribe. The tribes were named, one by one, with Joseph in place of Ephraim, and with Dan omitted. The sealed company was specifically Jewish. It was the people whose bones had only recently come back together in the latter days, marked and protected before the worst of the judgments broke loose. After them, John saw a great multitude that no man could number, of all nations and kindreds and people and tongues, standing before the throne and before the Lamb, clothed in white robes, with palms in their hands, crying out salvation to God. These were the ones who had come out of great tribulation, and had washed their robes, and made them white in the blood of the Lamb. Two distinct companies, the sealed Jewish remnant and the innumerable Gentile multitude, both saved, both standing. Then the seventh seal was opened. There was silence in heaven for about half an hour. The silence is one of the most chilling moments in the entire book. The choirs that had been singing without ceasing for the entire vision fell quiet. The four living creatures that had been crying, "Holy, holy, holy," without rest, stopped. Heaven itself held its breath, because what was about to be unleashed was so terrible that even the worship of the angels paused before it. 7 angels stood before God, and 7 trumpets were given to them. Another angel came and stood at the altar with a golden censer, and much incense was given to him to offer with the prayers of all saints upon the golden altar before the throne. The smoke of the incense, which were the prayers of the saints, ascended up before God out of the angel's hand. Then the angel took the censer and filled it with fire from the altar, and cast it onto the earth, and there were voices and thunderings and lightnings and an earthquake. The trumpets of the angels were prepared. The 7 trumpets are themselves a long sequence of judgments, and John describes them in painful detail. Hail and fire mingled with blood, cast upon the earth, burning a third part of the trees and all green grass. A great mountain burning with fire, cast into the sea, turning a third of the sea to blood. A great star falling from heaven, burning as if it were a lamp, falling upon a third part of the rivers, and the name of the star was Wormwood. A third of the sun and moon and stars darkened. A great star opened the bottomless pit, and out of the pit came smoke as the smoke of a great furnace, and out of the smoke came locusts upon the earth, with power as the scorpions of the earth have power. The locusts were not natural locusts. They had the shapes of horses prepared for battle. They had crowns like gold on their heads, and faces like men, and hair like women, and teeth like lions, and breastplates of iron. The sound of their wings was like the sound of chariots running into battle. They had tails like scorpions, and there were stings in their tails, and their power was to hurt men 5 months. They had a king over them, the angel of the bottomless pit, whose name in Hebrew is Abaddon, and in Greek is Apollyon, both meaning destroyer. 4 angels were loosed, which had been bound in the great river Euphrates. They had been prepared for an hour, and a day, and a month, and a year, to slay a third part of men. The number of the army of the horsemen was 200,000 million riders, with breastplates of fire and brimstone. By these were the third part of men killed, by the fire, and by the smoke, and by the brimstone, which issued out of the mouths of the horses. Between the trumpets, John saw and heard things he was forbidden to write down. 7 thunders uttered their voices, and he was about to write what they had said, but a voice from heaven told him to seal them up. The voice said, "Time shall be no longer." He was given a little book to eat, and the book was sweet in his mouth, like honey, but bitter in his belly. He was told that he must prophesy again before many peoples and nations and tongues and kings. He measured the temple. He saw 2 witnesses, 2 men of God, granted to prophesy 1,260 days, clothed in sackcloth. They had power to shut heaven that no rain fell, to turn waters to blood, and to smite the earth with all plagues as often as they willed. The beast that ascended out of the bottomless pit made war against them and killed them, and their dead bodies lay in the street of the great city, which spiritually is called Sodom and Egypt, where also our Lord was crucified. After 3 days and a half, the Spirit of life from God entered into them, and they stood upon their feet, and great fear fell upon those who saw them. A great voice from heaven said, "Come up hither." They ascended in a cloud, and their enemies watched them go. The 7th trumpet sounded. Great voices in heaven said, "The kingdoms of this world are become the kingdoms of our Lord and of his Christ, and he shall reign forever and ever." The 24 elders fell on their faces and worshipped God. The temple of God was opened in heaven, and the ark of his testament was seen in the temple, and there were lightnings and voices and thunderings and an earthquake and great hail. Then John saw a great wonder in heaven, a woman clothed with the sun, with the moon under her feet, and on her head a crown of 12 stars. She was with child. She cried, travailing in birth, and pained to be delivered. Another wonder appeared in heaven, a great red dragon with 7 heads and 10 horns and 7 crowns upon his heads. His tail drew the 3rd part of the stars of heaven and cast them to the earth. The dragon stood before the woman to devour her child as soon as it was born. She brought forth a man-child who was caught up unto God and to his throne. The woman fled into the wilderness, where she had a place prepared by God, that they should feed her there 1,260 days. The dragon was thrown out of heaven, and there was war in heaven. Michael and his angels fought against the dragon, and the dragon fought and his angels and prevailed not. Neither was their place found any more in heaven. And the great dragon was cast out, that old serpent called the devil and Satan, which deceiveth the whole world. He was cast out into the earth, and his angels were cast out with him. The serpent of the garden, the same serpent who had heard his sentence pronounced 4,000 years earlier, the serpent whose head had begun to crack the day the Lamb was nailed to the cross, was now thrown out of his last foothold in the heavens and confined to the earth, having great wrath because he knew his time was short. The dragon, finding himself on the earth, persecuted the woman who had brought forth the man-child, and went to make war with the remnant of her seed, which kept the commandments of God and held the testimony of Jesus Christ. He stood upon the sand of the sea and called up his agents. A beast rose up out of the sea with 7 heads and 10 horns, and upon his horns 10 crowns, and upon his heads the name of blasphemy. He had the body of a leopard, the feet of a bear, and the mouth of a lion. The dragon gave him his power and his seat and great authority. One of his heads had been wounded as if to death, and his deadly wound was healed, and all the world wondered after the beast. They worshipped the dragon which gave power unto the beast, and they worshipped the beast, saying, Who is like unto the beast? Who is able to make war with him? He was given a mouth, speaking great things and blasphemies, and power was given unto him to continue 42 months, 42 months, 3.5 years. The same period that had appeared in Daniel's 70th week, the same midpoint at which the prince was to break his covenant and stop the temple sacrifices. A second beast rose up, this one out of the earth. He had 2 horns like a lamb, but he spake as a dragon. He exercised all the power of the first beast before him, and caused the earth and them which dwell therein to worship the first beast, whose deadly wound was healed. He did great wonders, making fire come down from heaven on the earth in the sight of men. He deceived them by means of those miracles. He had power to give life unto the image of the beast, that the image of the beast should both speak, and cause that as many as would not worship the image of the beast should be killed. He caused all, both small and great, rich and poor, free and bond, to receive a mark in their right hand or in their foreheads, and that no man might buy or sell, save he that had the mark, or the name of the beast, or the number of his name. Here is wisdom. Let him that hath understanding count the number of the beast, for it is the number of a man, and his number is 666. 2 beasts, 2 figures of the Antichrist system. The first, the political ruler, the man who would deceive the nations and rule for 42 months. The second, the false prophet, the religious deceiver who would point all the world's worship toward the first. The second causes the first to be worshipped. The 2 of them together, with the dragon behind them, form a counterfeit trinity, an unholy mockery of the Father, the Son, and the Spirit. And their reign of terror, when it comes, will be such that no man can buy or sell except by their authority, and the price of refusing them will be death. John saw the Lamb stand on Mount Zion, and with him 144,000, having his Father's name written in their foreheads. He saw 3 angels flying through the midst of heaven, the first preaching the everlasting gospel to every nation and kindred and tongue and people, the second announcing the fall of Babylon the Great, the third warning that anyone who worshipped the beast and his image would drink of the wine of the wrath of God. He saw a great winepress trodden outside the city, and blood came out of the winepress even unto the horse bridles by the space of 1,600 furlongs. 7 angels were given 7 golden vials full of the wrath of God. The vials were poured out one after another, a noisome and grievous sore upon the men who had the mark. The sea became as the blood of a dead man, and every living soul died in the sea. The rivers and fountains of waters became blood. The sun scorched men with fire, and they blasphemed the name of God, and repented not to give him glory. The seat of the beast was darkened, and they gnawed their tongues for pain, and blasphemed the God of heaven because of their pains and their sores, and repented not of their deeds. The great river Euphrates was dried up, that the way of the kings of the east might be prepared. 3 unclean spirits like frogs came out of the mouth of the dragon, and out of the mouth of the beast, and out of the mouth of the false prophet, going forth unto the kings of the earth and the whole world, to gather them to the battle of that great day of God Almighty. They gathered them together into a place called in the Hebrew tongue Armageddon, the mountain of Megiddo in the plain of Esdraelon in northern Israel. The 7th vial was poured into the air. A great voice came out of the temple of heaven from the throne, saying, "It is done." The greatest earthquake the world had ever known struck. The great city was divided into 3 parts. The cities of the nations fell. Great Babylon came in remembrance before God, to give unto her the cup of the wine of the fierceness of his wrath. Every island fled away, and the mountains were not found. John was carried in the Spirit into the wilderness, and he saw a woman sitting on a scarlet beast, full of names of blasphemy, having 7 heads and 10 horns. She was arrayed in purple and scarlet, decked with gold and precious stones and pearls, having a golden cup in her hand, full of abominations and filthiness of her fornication. Upon her forehead was written a name, Mystery, Babylon the Great, the mother of harlots and abominations of the earth. She was drunk with the blood of the saints and with the blood of the martyrs of Jesus. The angel told John her interpretation. The 7 heads were 7 mountains on which the woman sat, and 7 kings. The 10 horns were 10 kings. The waters were peoples and multitudes and nations and tongues. The woman was the great city which reigned over the kings of the earth. Her fall, her burning, her desolation, her overthrow were proclaimed in detail. The merchants of the earth wept and mourned over her, because no man bought their merchandise any more. In 1 hour her judgment came. Rejoice over her, thou heaven, and ye holy apostles and prophets, for God hath avenged you on her. A great voice of much people in heaven cried, Alleluia! Salvation and glory and honor and power unto the Lord our God. The marriage supper of the Lamb was come, and his wife had made herself ready. Blessed are they which are called unto the marriage supper of the Lamb. And then the heavens opened. John saw a white horse. The rider on the white horse was not the counterfeit who had ridden out at the opening of the first seal. This was the true one. His eyes were as a flame of fire, and on his head were many crowns. And he had a name written that no man knew but he himself. And he was clothed with a vesture dipped in blood, and his name is called the Word of God. The armies which were in heaven followed him upon white horses, clothed in fine linen, white and clean. Out of his mouth went a sharp sword, that with it he should smite the nations. He had on his vesture and on his thigh a name written, King of Kings and Lord of Lords. The same Galilean carpenter who had stood silent before Pilate, who had been led like a lamb to the slaughter, who had been buried in a borrowed tomb, was now coming back at the head of the armies of heaven, and the cosmos itself bent to make way. The beast and the kings of the earth and their armies were gathered together to make war against him. The beast was taken, and with him the false prophet that wrought miracles before him, with which he had deceived them that had received the mark of the beast, and them that worshipped his image. These both were cast alive into a lake of fire, burning with brimstone. The remnant were slain with the sword of him that sat upon the horse, which sword proceeded out of his mouth. An angel came down from heaven, having the key of the bottomless pit and a great chain in his hand. He laid hold on the dragon, that old serpent, which is the devil and Satan, and bound him 1,000 years, and cast him into the bottomless pit, and shut him up, and set a seal upon him, that he should deceive the nations no more, till the 1,000 years should be fulfilled. The 1,000 years that followed were the long peace promised by the prophets of an earlier age, the millennium during which the lion would lie down with the lamb, the swords would be beaten into plowshares, the wolf would dwell with the lamb, and a little child would lead them. The thrones were set, and they that sat upon them, and judgment was given unto them. The souls of the martyrs and of the faithful lived and reigned with Christ 1,000 years. This was the first resurrection. The rest of the dead lived not again until the 1,000 years were finished. When the 1,000 years were ended, Satan was loosed for a little season. He went out to deceive the nations one final time, gathering them to battle, the number of whom is as the sand of the sea. Fire came down from God out of heaven and devoured them. The devil that deceived them was cast into the lake of fire and brimstone, where the beast and the false prophet already were, and they were tormented day and night forever and ever. Then John saw a great white throne, and him that sat on it, from whose face the earth and the heaven fled away, and there was found no place for them. He saw the dead, small and great, stand before God. The books were opened. Another book was opened, which is the book of life. The dead were judged out of those things which were written in the books, according to their works. The sea gave up the dead which were in it, and death and hell delivered up the dead which were in them. They were judged every man according to their works. Death and hell were cast into the lake of fire. This is the second death. Whosoever was not found written in the book of life was cast into the lake of fire. The accountancy of God, which had been opened in the garden when the curse fell on the serpent, was now closed. Every account was settled. Every name was read. Every life was reckoned with. And then, when the long story of human sin and divine patience had finally come to its end, John saw the new thing. And I saw a new heaven and a new earth, for the first heaven and the first earth were passed away, and there was no more sea. He saw the holy city, New Jerusalem, coming down from God out of heaven, prepared as a bride adorned for her husband. A great voice from heaven said, Behold, the tabernacle of God is with men, and he will dwell with them, and they shall be his people, and God himself shall be with them, and be their God. And God shall wipe away all tears from their eyes, and there shall be no more death, neither sorrow nor crying, neither shall there be any more pain, for the former things are passed away. He that sat upon the throne said, Behold, I make all things new. The New Jerusalem descended. Its walls were of jasper, and the city was pure gold, like unto clear glass. The foundations of the wall were garnished with all manner of precious stones, jasper, sapphire, chalcedony, emerald, sardonyx, sardius, chrysolite, beryl, topaz, chrysoprasus, jacinth, amethyst. The 12 gates were 12 pearls. Every several gate was of 1 pearl. The street of the city was pure gold, as it were transparent glass. There was no temple in the city, for the Lord God Almighty and the Lamb were the temple of it. The city had no need of the sun, neither of the moon, to shine in it, for the glory of God did lighten it, and the Lamb was the light thereof. The nations of them which are saved walked in the light of it. The gates of it were not shut at all by day, for there was no night there. The kings of the earth brought their glory and honor into it. There entered into it nothing that defiled. A pure river of water of life proceeded out of the throne of God and of the Lamb. In the midst of the street, on either side of the river, was the tree of life, which bore 12 manner of fruits, yielding her fruit every month. The leaves of the tree were for the healing of the nations. There was no more curse. The throne of God and of the Lamb was in it, and his servants served him. They saw his face, and his name was in their foreheads. There was no night there, and they needed no candle, neither light of the sun, for the Lord God gave them light. And they shall reign forever and ever. The serpent in the garden, 4,000 years before, had heard a sentence pronounced over his head. Now the sentence had been carried out. The seed of the woman had crushed the head. The Lamb who had been slain had returned as the Lion of the tribe of Judah and had reigned. The bones in the valley had stood up. The temple in Jerusalem had been thrown down and would in due time no longer be needed at all. The man of sorrows had become the King of kings. The 70th week of Daniel had run its course. The promise made in the cool of the evening to a frightened couple hiding in the trees had been kept in every detail, in a city whose foundations were the names of the 12 apostles of the Lamb, one of whom was the old man kneeling on the rocky island of Patmos, with the vision flooding through him, the only one of the original 12 still alive on earth, the last living witness, the disciple Jesus loved. He was told to write what he had seen. He was warned not to add to the words of the prophecy of this book, and not to take away from the words of it, on pain of severe judgment. He was promised that the Lord of all things would come quickly, and to that promise he gave the answer that has closed every Christian Bible since. Even so, come, Lord Jesus. He came down from his cave on the morning after the vision, or after the days of visions, and he began to write. The book was carried off the island and copied and circulated among the 7 churches of Asia. John himself was eventually allowed to leave Patmos when the Emperor Domitian was assassinated in the year 96, after Christ and the new Emperor Nerva reversed many of the persecutions of his predecessor. John returned to Ephesus, an old man of nearly 100, and lived out his last years there. He was so frail at the end that he had to be carried into the assemblies on a stretcher, and his teaching was reduced, the old tradition records, to a single repeated sentence delivered to the gathered congregation. Little children, love one another. When the disciples asked him why he kept saying only this, he answered, because it is the commandment of the Lord, and if it alone is kept, it is enough. He died around the year 100, after Christ, the last of the 12. He had been a teenager when he met the carpenter on the shore of Galilee. He had been an old man when he saw the carpenter again on the rocky island in the Aegean. Between those two meetings lay almost the entire span of the 1st century after Christ, the founding generation of the church, the laying down of every word of the New Testament, and the unveiling of the entire arc of the future, from the throne in heaven to the new Jerusalem coming down. He had been told that the words were faithful and true. He had been told that the Lord of all things stood at the door and knocked, and that whoever opened the door would dine with him. He had been told that the time was at hand. He had written it all down. And the words he had written, the last great prophecy of Scripture, would join the 4,000 years of accumulated prophecy that had come before it, gathering up the whisper in the garden. The Lamb led to the slaughter, the 70 weeks counted out in Babylon, the temple thrown down by the legions of Titus, the bones reassembling in the valley of dispersion, all of them folded into the single closing vision of the old man on the prison island, all of them pointing forward to the same horizon, the horizon at which the curtain of human history would finally part, and the long, weary, bleeding story would be revealed for what it had always been, an unfolding of a plan written before the foundation of the world by a God who had spoken of these things from the very beginning, by the mouth of all his holy prophets since the world began.